12
How could you sign
interpreters,
that contract
8
without my
countries,
approval? You knew
$100
the
million
risk.
on the
It had to be
line,
done.
and the entire
I am the
negotiation was
CEO.
collapsing in real time. In that glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor, the most powerful executives in the world were losing everything. Not to competition, not to politics, but to a single misunderstood sentence. Nobody noticed the man standing outside the glass, the man with the mop, the man who understood every single word being spoken. This is the story of Ethan Cole, the invisible man who changed everything the day the world finally looked up. Stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The alarm didn't wake Ethan Cole. He was already awake. He had been awake for a while actually, lying flat on his back in the dark, staring at the water stain on the ceiling of their apartment that looked vaguely like a bird trying to take flight. He'd named it. Weeks ago, on a sleepless night not unlike this one, he had decided the water stain looked exactly like a sparrow caught mid-wing, frozen in the plaster, permanently suspended between leaving and staying. He called it Emma's bird because Emma had seen it first. "Daddy," she had said, climbing onto his chest with both knees and pointing upward with one small finger. "That bird is trying really hard." He had laughed at that. He still did, privately, in the mornings when the world felt too heavy to carry. 5:47 a.m. The red numbers on the digital clock beside his bed glowed in the dark like a quiet emergency. Outside the single window of the bedroom, Manhattan hadn't started yet. The city was in that strange, held-breath hour, too late for the last of the night people, too early for the first of the morning ones. A garbage truck groaned somewhere below. A siren wailed 3 blocks east and faded. Then silence again. The imperfect silence of a city that never fully slept. Ethan sat up slowly. He was 32 years old, but some mornings his body greeted him like it had lived considerably longer. His right shoulder ached where he'd strained it 2 months ago moving a commercial floor polisher up a stairwell. His lower back registered a dull, familiar complaint. He rolled his neck. Something clicked. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds, not sleeping, just resetting, then swung both legs off the mattress and stood. The apartment was small. This was the polite word for it. 620 square feet on the 4th floor of a building on West 148th Street in Harlem, where the elevator had been broken for 11 months, and the landlord's idea of maintenance was a phone call that went straight to voicemail. The walls were thin enough that Ethan knew his neighbor, Mr. Okonkwo's entire morning routine by heart. The specific creak of his bed at 6, the trumpet blast of the shower pipes, the smell of a goosey soup that somehow materialized at 7:30, regardless of the day or season. It wasn't much, but Ethan had stopped apologizing for what he had a long time ago. Apologies were expensive, and he was a man who tracked his expenses carefully. He moved through the apartment without turning on any lights. He knew every step, every corner, every squeaky floorboard to avoid. Past the narrow kitchen where he'd taped a vocabulary list to the cabinet above the coffee maker. Past the small table where Emma's school backpack sat already packed for the day. Down the hall, pausing at the door to her room. He pushed it open an inch, just enough to see. Emma Cole, 8 years old, slept the way children slept when they felt entirely safe, completely sideways across the mattress. One arm flung wide, the blanket wrapped around only her feet. Her hair was loose and spread across the pillow like a dark crown.
You knew
Her
the
face,
risk.
even in
It
sleep,
had to be
had that
done.
quality Ethan could
I am
never
the
fully
CEO.
describe. A kind of luminous seriousness, as though even in dreams she was paying close attention to something important. She had her mother's face, the same slightly upturned nose, the same long lashes. Looking at Emma sometimes felt like a gift and a wound delivered simultaneously. Ethan watched her breathe for a moment. Then he pulled the door back to its original position and went to make breakfast. Making breakfast for Emma was not a task. It was a ritual, and Ethan treated it with the seriousness of one. He filled the kettle, set it on the burner, and began moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of a man who has made the same motions so many times they've become something close to meditation. 2 eggs from the carton. He counted what was left. 6. Enough for 3 more mornings. He cracked them into the pan, added a pinch of salt, the way Emma liked. While they cooked, he sliced half a banana and arranged the pieces on the plate in a small arc, which Emma called his banana smiles, and which she pretended to find embarrassing even though Ethan had caught her smiling at them more than once. Toast. Butter. A small glass of orange juice from the concentrate. The real kind was $4 more, and he was 3 weeks from his next paycheck. He stood at the stove and stirred the eggs and looked out the kitchen window at the building across the alley. In the window of the 4th floor opposite, a light was already on. A woman he'd never met moved through her own kitchen, and the two of them existed for a moment in that strange, intimate parallel. Two strangers, two separate silences, two mornings that would never touch. The kettle whistled. He poured the hot water and stood with his hands around the mug, letting the warmth move through his palms. This was the hour Ethan thought most clearly. Before the shift, before the commute, before the building and the floors and the carts loaded with cleaning supplies. Before the world got its hands on the day and pressed its fingerprints all over it. This was the hour that belonged to him, and he guarded it carefully. He picked up the worn paperback sitting on the edge of the counter, Intermediate Swahili, a practical grammar, and read 2 pages while the eggs finished. He was on his 7th language, technically, if he counted Swahili as still in progress. He preferred not to count anything as finished. There was always more to know. 15 minutes later, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing her school uniform, navy blue skirt, white blouse, with one sock on and one sock still in her hand, and her hair was a magnificent disaster. "Morning," she said, without significant enthusiasm. Emma was not a morning person. This was a fact she had stated plainly at age 6 and had defended with considerable consistency since. "Morning," Ethan said. "Sit, eat." She dropped into her chair, looked at the banana smile, and made a face that was clearly covering an actual smile. She picked up her fork. "Ms. Patterson gave us a project," she announced, in the tone of someone reporting mild criminal activity. "What kind of project?" "A family history project." She stabbed an egg without ceremony. "We have to make a poster about where our family comes from." Ethan sat across from her and wrapped his hands around his mug. "That sounds like a good project." "It's a lot of work." "Most good things are." Emma looked up at him over her fork. This was a look he recognized. The look that meant she was deciding whether to continue the conversation or drop it. She chewed, swallowed, made a decision. "Where do we come from?" she asked. "I mean, like, really come from?" Ethan considered this. It was the kind of question that deserved an honest answer. "Your grandmother on my side was from Trinidad," he said. "Her grandmother came from West Africa, Nigeria, specifically, though the records don't go further back than that. Your mom's family were Puerto Rican, 3rd generation. Before that, the Dominican Republic. And before that, the island of Hispaniola going back 300 years. He paused. "So you come from a lot of places, Em. You come from the whole Atlantic, basically." Emma absorbed this with characteristic seriousness. "That's a big poster," she said finally. Ethan smiled. "Get a big piece of paper." He did her hair after breakfast. 2 braids, tight and even, which had taken him over a year to learn properly. In the early days after Sarah died, the braids had been uneven, lopsided things that Emma wore to school without complaint, and that Ethan lay awake at night thinking about with a specific, focused shame. He had watched videos. He had practiced on a wig he'd bought at a dollar store on 125th Street. He had asked Mrs. Delgado next door to show him, twice, until he understood the tension and the pattern. Now the braids were clean and straight, small victories. He had learned to build a life out of them. "Perfect," Emma said, inspecting them in the bathroom mirror with the air of a quality control specialist. "You're getting better." "High praise," Ethan said. She looked at him in the mirror. For a moment, her face softened from its default expression of watchful analysis into something more open, more childlike. "Are you working late tonight?" she asked. 7 to 3, he said. "Mrs. Delgado will be here when you get home from school. I'll be back before you wake up." Emma nodded. This was the rhythm of their life, and she had made her peace with it. More peace, Ethan sometimes thought, than an 8-year-old should have to make with anything. But she didn't complain. She never complained about the things that truly mattered. She saved her complaints for homework and vegetables, which seemed right. "Okay," she said. Then, in the way of children who have learned to say important things sideways, "I made you something." She disappeared into her room and came back holding a folded piece of notebook paper. She handed it to him with a brief, efficient gesture, like a diplomat presenting credentials, and then immediately became very interested in the bathroom wall. Ethan unfolded it. Inside, in Emma's careful 8-year-old printing, it read, "You are the best dad. You know everything. I love you 1,000." Below the words, she had drawn a picture of the two of them. Stick figures, but detailed ones, with his cleaning uniform carefully represented, mop in hand, and herself small beside him holding what appeared to be a book. Ethan folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket, against his shirt, over his heart, where he kept things that needed protecting. "Thank you, Em," he said. "It's just paper," she said to the wall. The Harmon Tower was 42 floors of glass and steel rising from the middle of Midtown Manhattan, like a monument to the kind of money that moved quietly and internationally and left no fingerprints. It housed the global headquarters of Meridian International Group, a conglomerate whose interests spanned commercial real estate, logistics infrastructure, and cross-border investment across 4 continents. It was the kind of company whose name appeared often in the financial press and rarely in conversation, because the people who ran it preferred that arrangement. Ethan arrived at 6:55 p.m. through the service entrance on 52nd Street. This was not the entrance with the marble floors and the security desk staffed by men in suits who nodded at the executives with a professional respect calibrated to exact organizational rank. The service entrance was around the corner, past the loading dock, through a door that required a key card, and opened into a hallway lit with fluorescent tubes that buzzed faintly at a frequency designed to be just below conscious irritation. He swiped his badge. The door opened. He went inside. The cleaning crew for the upper floors checked in at the basement office, a room that smelled of industrial solvent and old coffee, where a bulletin board held the nightly assignments printed on pale yellow sheets. Ethan found his sheet, scanned it. Tonight, floors 38 through 42. Executive level, conference suite. He changed into his uniform in the locker room. Navy blue with the building services logo on the chest, his name stitched above the left pocket in white thread. Ethan. Just the first name, as though the rest of him wasn't worth the thread. He gathered his cart, mop, bucket, cleaning solutions organized by type, glass cleaner, trash bags, paper towels, the floor buffer for the hallways. He loaded everything with the calm, automatic competence of someone who had performed this exact sequence hundreds of times. Around him, other members of the cleaning crew prepared their own carts. There was Luis from Ecuador, who sang quietly in Spanish under his breath, and had the fastest mop technique Ethan had ever witnessed. There was Yolanda from Jamaica, who could strip and wax a floor in 35 minutes, and who had been doing this job for 19 years and had opinions about everything, which she shared freely. There was Dmitry from Ukraine, who spoke very little English but communicated with remarkable expressiveness through eyebrows alone. "Floor 42 tonight," Yolanda said, looking at Ethan's assignment sheet. She raised an eyebrow. "Conference suite," Ethan confirmed. She made a sound in the back of her throat. "Big summit tomorrow. They said international people coming. I heard some of the day crew talking." She began pulling on rubber gloves. "You know what that means. More glasses to wash, more mess to clean," she said, with the gravity of someone presenting evidence to a jury. "These international business people, they come in here, they leave food everywhere, they don't put lids back on the coffee pods." "Yolanda. I'm just saying." Ethan smiled and took his cart to the elevator. The upper floors of Harmon Tower were a different country from the basement. The elevator opened on 38, and the first thing that changed was the air. Climate controlled with a precision that felt almost surgical, carrying the faint, expensive scent of fresh flowers and leather. The carpet up here was the deep charcoal kind that absorbed sound completely, so that you moved through the corridor in a hush that felt almost reverential, as though the floor itself was demanding silence. The offices on these floors were the kind of offices that appeared in magazine profiles. Glass walls and angular furniture and art that had been selected by people who charged consulting fees for art selection. Desks of pale wood with no clutter visible, because disorder had been architecturally eliminated from the space. Everything up here said, in a quiet and absolute way, that this is where the decisions are made. Ethan pushed his cart along the corridor and began his rounds. He had learned in 3 years of cleaning these floors to become almost perfectly invisible. This was not an accident. It was a skill he had developed deliberately. The particular quality of stillness that allowed him to move through a space without registering in the peripheral vision of the people around him. He kept his movements smooth and economical. He kept his eyes appropriately lowered. He learned which areas were occupied and which were empty, and he sequenced his work accordingly. The invisibility was practical. When he was invisible, he was not interrupted. When he was not interrupted, he could think. And thinking, for Ethan Cole, was a complex and continuous operation. Tonight, as he worked his way through the empty conference rooms on 39, he ran through his Swahili verb conjugations in his mind, the irregular forms, the ones that required memorization rather than pattern. Kusoma, to read. Ninapasoma, while I am reading. Nilasoma, I read, past tense. He worked through them silently, his lips occasionally moving, his hands moving equally silently across the surfaces of the room. He had learned Mandarin in the grocery store. This was not a metaphor. The store, Chen's Family Market, on the corner of 149th and 8th, had been owned by a man named Henry Chen, who was 71 years old, who had immigrated from Fujian province in the early 1980s, and who considered the presence of customers in his store an acceptable but not required component of its daily operation. What Henry Chen actually loved was conversation, specifically the kind that involved disagreement, debate, and the vigorous defense of positions. Ethan had started shopping there when he was 23, living 3 blocks away, and he had made the catastrophic error, from a time efficiency perspective, of responding to something Henry Chen said about the quality of modern education. That conversation had lasted 4 hours and had ended with Henry lending him a book. Over the following 2 years, Ethan had learned Mandarin Chinese. Not from the book was about economics, but from Henry, who taught him in the way that most things worth knowing are taught, through daily repetition, correction, argument, and the slow accumulation of understanding one sentence at a time. Henry Chen had died 4 years ago, and Ethan still felt the loss of him with a quiet regularity, the way you feel the absence of a particular kind of light in a room after a lamp has been taken away. He moved up to the 40th floor at 9:15 p.m. The conference suite on 40 was the building's largest, a room that could seat 30 people around a central table of polished dark wood, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Midtown on 3 sides. On clear days, the view extended to the bridges. Tonight, with the city lit and the sky a deep urban orange above the skyline, the room had a kind of theatrical grandeur that Ethan always noticed and never said anything about. The room had been prepared for something. He could see it, the small national flags arranged along the center of the table, 8 of them, representing 8 different nations. The translation equipment had been set up at each chair, the small wireless earpieces, the interpretation panels, the microphones. Bottles of water were placed at precise intervals, notepads and pens at each position, folders in different colors. He didn't open them, it wasn't his business, stacked with corporate precision at each seat. He counted the flags quietly as he worked. Brazil, Germany, Japan, France, Saudi Arabia, Mexico, South Korea, Australia, 8 countries, 1 table. Whatever they were deciding in this room tomorrow would touch people who would never know this room existed. He cleaned it carefully. The table, the windows, the floors, the leather chairs. He emptied the bins. He restocked the small service station at the back of the room with coffee supplies and mineral water. He moved through the space with his usual efficiency and his usual quiet, and when he was done, he stood for a moment at the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there on the 4th floor of a building on 148th Street, his daughter was asleep sideways across her mattress with her hair spread across her pillow like a crown. He thought, as he sometimes did in these quiet upper floor moments, one day. He wasn't sure what shape one day took exactly. He had learned to be careful with the future, to hold it gently rather than grip it, because gripping had a way of crushing things. But he believed in it. He believed in the direction they were moving, even when the movement was so slow it was nearly imperceptible. He pushed his cart back into the corridor and continued his rounds. There was a pause in the work around midnight. 30 minutes, where the cleaning crew gathered in the service break room on the 38th floor, which was a polite description for a closet-sized room with a microwave, a folding table, 4 chairs, and a coffee maker of significant age. Ethan sat with his coffee and his Swahili grammar and his own company. Luis came in, poured coffee, looked at the book. "What language is that one?" he asked. Not mockingly. Luis had learned a long time ago that the books were a permanent feature of Ethan's breaks, the way some people had their phones. "Swahili," Ethan said. Luis nodded with genuine interest. "How many is that now?" "7, more or less. 8 if you count Swahili, which I'm still working on." Luis shook his head, but admiringly, the way someone shakes their head at a thing they find impressive rather than inexplicable. "And you learned them all just reading books? On your own?" "Books, people, mostly people." Ethan closed the grammar. "You learn a language from people. Books just give you the structure. People give you the music." "English was hard for me," Luis said. He sat down across from Ethan. "I was here 3 years before I felt like I could say what I actually meant. Before that, I could only say what I knew the words for, which is different." "Very different," Ethan agreed. "Does it help, the languages?" Luis asked. "At work, I mean. Does anyone up here—" He gestured vaguely toward the ceiling, toward the executive floors. "Do they ever notice?" Ethan looked at his coffee. He turned the mug slowly in his hands. "No," he said. He said it simply, without resentment or bitterness, because resentment was a luxury he'd decided years ago he couldn't afford. But the words sat between them for a moment before Luis nodded, finished his coffee, and went back to work.
¿Qué pasa?
At 1:30 a.m., the building was as quiet as it ever got. Ethan was working the corridor outside the executive offices on 42. Long, slow passes with the floor buffer, back and forth. The machine's steady hum, the only sound on the floor. He'd turned the overhead lights to low, the way you could do after midnight when there was no one around, and the corridor was lit with a softer amber glow that made the dark wood of the office doors look almost warm. He was thinking in French. He did this sometimes, yes, picked a language and thought in it for an hour, not translating but inhabiting. He'd been doing this since his early 20s, and he believed it was the reason his languages had depth rather than just vocabulary. You couldn't truly know a language until you dreamed in it, until you could be angry in it, frightened in it, tender in it. He'd been angry in 7 languages. He'd been tender in 5. He'd dreamed fluently in 4. Je dois retrouver un peu de calme, he thought. I need to find some peace. The buffer hummed. The floor took on its shine. He watched his own distorted reflection move beneath him in the polished surface. He thought about Sarah. He did this less often now than in the early years, not because he'd stopped loving her, but because the love had changed shape. It was less jagged now, less capable of ambushing him at the center of an ordinary moment. It had become something quieter, a presence rather than an ache, the way a room still has the quality of a person in it even after they've left. Sarah Cole had been 28 when she died. Cerebral aneurysm. Sudden, catastrophic, and almost entirely without warning. One afternoon she had been making coffee in their kitchen and describing a book she was reading, and then she was on the floor, and then she was in the hospital, and then she was gone. 4 days from the kitchen to the silence. 4 days in which Ethan had sat beside her bed, holding her hand and talking to her in every language he knew, as though sheer linguistic range might constitute some kind of prayer. Emma had been 3 years old. Emma remembered almost nothing. She remembered a smell, something floral, her mother's shampoo, and a quality of voice and arms and safety. She told Ethan these things with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone cataloging what they had and what they didn't, and it had cost him considerably more than he'd shown. He had stood over Emma's crib the night after Sarah's funeral and made a decision that was less a decision than an oath. I will not let anything else disappear. I will hold whatever I can hold. The university linguistics program he'd been accepted to disappeared first. Then the apartment he'd shared with Sarah. Then the modest savings. Then 2 jobs he'd cycled through in the first year, unable to balance the hours with Emma's needs. Eventually, he'd found this, the cleaning contract for Harmon Tower. Night shift, which aligned with Emma's school schedule. Steady hours, steady pay. Health insurance, which was not nothing. He'd learned to live inside the life he had. The buffer hummed. The corridor shone. One day, The summit was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. Ethan finished his shift at 3 in the morning and took the subway home, 40 minutes on the C train, sitting in the nearly empty car with his Swahili grammar open on his lap and his cleaning bag between his feet. Around him, the city's overnight population, nurses coming off shifts, kitchen workers from restaurant closes, the particular population of people who move through New York in the hours that most of New York never sees, occupied the other seats in their individual silences. He was home at 3:55 a.m. Emma was asleep, still sideways, still crowned. He pulled her blanket up and stood in her doorway for the count of 4 breaths, then went to his own room and lay down. He slept until 7. But that morning was ordinary in its details. Breakfast, Emma had leftover rice with eggs because they were out of toast bread, a situation she greeted with calm pragmatism. He did her braids. She packed her bag. They went through her vocabulary for a spelling test she had on Thursday. Photograph, environment, necessary, accommodation. Accommodation has 2 C's and 2 M's, Emma said. I keep putting 1 C. Write it 5 times, Ethan said. That's how you own it. She wrote it 5 times, with the focused handwriting of someone taking the matter seriously. What's today? She asked, not looking up from the paper. Tuesday. What are you doing today? Sleeping until noon, then I have some errands, then back to work tonight. Emma nodded. She finished her 5th accommodation and examined the page. Can I come see the building sometime? She said. The tall one. Ethan considered this. Emma had asked before, periodically. She knew the shape of his life in broad strokes. She knew he cleaned the offices in the big building in Midtown. She knew it was at night. She knew it was hard work. She'd never asked in a way that contained judgment, only curiosity. Maybe on a Saturday sometime, he said. They have a lobby with a big installation piece, a sculpture. You'd like it. What kind of sculpture? Metal. Abstract. It looks different from every angle. Emma absorbed this. Like a story, she said. Ethan looked at her. I mean, she said, a little self-conscious now, how a story looks different depending on where you're standing. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old, and occasionally said things that landed in him with the specific gravity of something important. Exactly like that, he said. He was back at Harmon Tower by 6:45 that evening, earlier than his actual shift, which started at 7, because he'd forgotten that he'd left his personal grammar book in the break room the night before and wanted to retrieve it before the shift. He entered through the service entrance, swiped his card, went in. The building was different in the late afternoon. The executive floors were still occupied, the summit had run through the day, and the corridor outside the cleaning crew's storage areas was busy with late afternoon organizational energy, assistants moving purposefully with folders, a caterer making a delivery from the elevator, 2 security personnel discussing something in the tone of people who have been discussing the same thing for several hours. Ethan retrieved his book from the break room. He was passing back through the service corridor on his way to the elevator when he heard it. Voices. Raised voices, plural, speaking over each other in different languages. He slowed. The service corridor ran alongside the back of the conference suite on 40, the same room he had cleaned the previous night, the same room with the 8 national flags. The wall between the corridor and the room was glass from the waist up, frosted for privacy, but not completely soundproofed. The sounds coming through the wall were unmistakable, the specific acoustic signature of a conversation that had gone wrong. Not wrong in the way of argument, wrong in the deeper, more dangerous way of misunderstanding, where people were certain they knew what was being said and were equally, irreconcilably wrong about it. He stopped. He listened. Through the frosted glass wall in the conference room beyond, 8 delegations from 8 countries were in the process of losing a negotiation that had taken 14 months to organize. Ethan couldn't see the faces clearly. The glass blurred everything, but he could hear with perfect clarity. And what he heard assembled itself in his mind with the rapid, automatic precision of someone who had spent 15 years learning to parse meaning from sound. The Mandarin-speaking delegate, a man, older, with the formal diction of a senior official, had said something that was causing the entire room to stiffen. The English interpretation, when it came through the earpiece system at low volume through the glass, rendered it as, "The Meridian proposal is unacceptable under current parameters." Ethan heard the original Mandarin. "The Meridian proposal, under current parameters, requires further clarification before we can move forward productively." These were not the same sentence. One was a rejection, the other was a question. The room did not know they were different. He heard the response from the German delegation, clipped, formal, with the edge that comes from a person who believes they have just been insulted. He heard the Arabic representative respond to something in a way that had clearly been, in translation, rendered far more aggressive than its original form. He heard a phrase in Portuguese that he recognized as a specific idiomatic expression meaning, "I remain open to negotiation," translated, incorrectly, fatally, as a conditional refusal. He heard the room turning. He felt something clench in his chest, not metaphorically but physically, a tightening across the sternum that he recognized as the specific sensation of watching something break that didn't have to break. He stood in the service corridor with his grammar book under his arm and his cleaning badge clipped to his chest, and he listened to 14 months of international negotiation falling apart one mistranslation at a time. He told himself it wasn't his place. He told himself there were professional interpreters in that room, qualified people with credentials and training and institutional backing. He told himself he was a cleaning staff member, and this was the 42nd floor of a building where he did not belong in rooms with national flags and men in suits who negotiated the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars. He told himself all of these things, and then he heard the Arabic delegate say, quietly, in Arabic, that no interpreter in the room appeared to understand, "Perhaps this is simply not possible. Perhaps we should all go home." And there was a silence that fell over the room that even through frosted glass and a concrete wall was audible and complete. Ethan Cole stood in a service corridor and looked at his reflection in the glass wall and looked at the grammar book under his arm and felt the full weight of who he was and what he was and everything he'd ever chosen and everything that had been chosen for him. And he thought about Emma writing accommodation 5 times with the serious handwriting of someone learning to own a thing. He knocked on the door. The door opened from the inside. It was a security guard, one of the 2 he'd seen in the corridor earlier. A large man in a dark blazer who regarded Ethan with the particular expression of someone encountering something entirely outside the category of expected events. "Can I help you?" he said, in the tone of someone who actually meant you shouldn't be here. "I'd like to speak to whoever is in charge," Ethan said, "about a translation problem." The guard looked at him. Ethan watched the man's eyes make the rapid assessment. The navy blue uniform, the building services badge with the first name only, the mop that was, in fact, not in Ethan's hands but rather on his cart in the corridor, but which seemed to the guard to be implied. "Sir, this is a private international summit." "I know what it is," Ethan said. "The Chinese delegate didn't say the proposal was unacceptable. He said it needed clarification. That distinction is costing everyone in that room a very significant amount of time and money." He said it quietly, without theater or urgency, the way he said most things. The guard processed this. "Wait here," he said. He closed the door. Ethan waited. 45 seconds passed. The door opened again. Charlotte Hayes was standing in the doorway. She was 30 years old, and she held herself the way people do when they have learned through repeated experience that the room reorganizes itself around their presence. She was wearing a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, her dark hair pulled back precisely, and she held a pen in one hand that she appeared to have been using when she was interrupted because she hadn't set it down. Her eyes were dark and very direct, with the quality of a person who was accustomed to reading situations rapidly and accurately. She looked at Ethan. She read the uniform. She read the badge. She read his face with the same rapid efficiency. "I was told you have information about a translation problem," she said. "Yes," Ethan said. "You're—" She glanced at his badge. "Ethan, Building Services." "Yes, and you believe you have something to contribute to an 8-party international trade negotiation." There was no mockery in her voice. It was a statement of something that sounded, to a rational person, almost implausible, delivered in the tone of someone who dealt in facts. "The Mandarin-speaking delegate made a statement that your interpreter translated as a rejection," Ethan said. "It wasn't a rejection. It was a request for clarification. The Arabic delegate has been responding to what he believes are aggressive statements from the German side because they were mistranslated as such. And approximately 15 minutes ago, a phrase in Portuguese that constituted an explicit statement of continued openness to negotiation was rendered in English as a conditional refusal. He paused. These are three separate and compounding errors. Together, they have produced a room that believes the negotiation has failed, when in fact, everyone in that room is still prepared to make a deal. Charlotte Hayes looked at him for a long, very still moment. "How do you speak Mandarin?" she said. "A grocery store owner taught me," Ethan said. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't fully read. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "You have 60 seconds," she said. "Use them." He walked into the room with the 8 national flags. He walked in holding his grammar book under one arm and wearing his building services uniform with his name stitched in white thread above the chest pocket. And the room, 30 people, 12 interpreters seated along the side walls, 8 delegations around the dark wood table, assistants and advisors in chairs behind, turned toward him with the unified focus of a room that had just experienced something unexpected. He felt it. The assessment, the uniforms and titles scan, the slight shift of disbelief through the space. He set the grammar book down on a side table near the door because his hands needed to be free. He looked at the room. He identified the Chinese delegate by the flag in front of him, a man in his mid-60s with silver at his temples and, currently, an expression of exhausted frustration that Ethan recognized immediately as the specific frustration of a person who has been misunderstood repeatedly and is beginning to believe the misunderstanding is permanent. Ethan spoke Mandarin, not haltingly, not with the careful construction of someone searching for words. He spoke it the way Henry Chen had taught him, with the rhythm and intonation of Fujian-influenced Putonghua, with the tonal precision that separated meaning from noise, with the particular courtesies of formal diplomatic register. He said, "Mr. Delegate, I believe there was an error in translation. I understood you to say that the proposal requires further clarification before productive movement is possible, not that you are rejecting the proposal. Is that correct?" The room was entirely silent. The Chinese delegate stared at him. Then the man's expression changed, the frustration releasing, the recognition moving across his face like light moving across a surface. "Yes," he said in Mandarin. "That is exactly what I meant. I have been trying to say this for 45 minutes. Ethan turned to the room and translated this into English, precisely, completely. Then he turned to the German delegation. He spoke German to the German delegates, clear, standard Hochdeutsch, addressing the specific phrasing that had been interpreted as aggression, clarifying its original intent, walking back through the 45 minutes of escalating misunderstanding with the careful patience of someone diffusing something very carefully. He turned to the Arabic representative. He spoke Arabic, Gulf dialect, which he'd learned from late-night radio broadcasts and a Lebanese newsstand owner on Amsterdam Avenue who had strong opinions about contemporary Arabic literature. He addressed the accumulated tensions, the misattributed aggressions, the thing that had been lost. He spoke Portuguese to the Brazilian delegation, in the specific cadences of Brazilian Portuguese rather than European, because the distinction mattered, and because Ethan Cole did not do things approximately. He moved through the room, German, French, Japanese, Spanish, back to Mandarin, English that functioned as the connective tissue between all of it, not performing, not displaying, but working, simply, clearly, working, like a man who has a skill and is using it. The room changed. It happened slowly at first and then with gathering speed, the way a climate changes when a weather system moves through. Not dramatic, but unmistakable, felt in the body before it's visible to the eye. The tight set of the German delegate's jaw released. The Arabic representative leaned forward slightly, into the table rather than away from it. The Chinese delegate made a small, precise gesture of acknowledgement that Ethan recognized from Henry Chen as meaning at last. The Brazilian delegation conferred briefly, quietly, and looked up with expressions newly open. Confusion moved toward understanding. Tension moved toward something approaching cooperation. Charlotte Hayes stood at the head of the table and watched. He spoke for 18 minutes. In the 60 seconds she had given him, she had clearly recalculated something, some internal assessment. and extended the authorization silently, without announcement, the way executives sometimes make their most consequential decisions, without ceremony and without going back. When he was done, when the compound misunderstandings had been addressed, the diplomatic record corrected, the room's temperature restored to something workable, Ethan stepped back from the table. He looked at Charlotte Hayes. She was looking at him. In her expression, he could not find the thing he had half expected. The condescension, the visible recalibration of his place in the hierarchy, the "thank you, you can go now," that the situation seemed to anticipate. What he found was harder to read, steadier, more serious. "Thank you," she said simply. "Of course," Ethan said. He picked up his grammar book from the side table and walked back out through the door. In the service corridor, he exhaled. He stood with his back against the wall and the grammar book against his chest, and he breathed quietly, in the way of someone who has done something that cost them more than it appeared to cost them. Then he straightened up, picked up his cart, and finished the floors. His daughter's note was still folded in his chest pocket, over his heart. "You know everything." He didn't. But sometimes knowing enough was enough. The floors got finished. That was the thing about a life built on discipline and small dignities. The extraordinary did not excuse you from the ordinary. The conference room had been transformed, a negotiation saved, 18 minutes of his voice moving through 8 languages like a current through still water. And then Ethan Cole had picked up his cart and finished the floors on 42 with the same careful attention he brought to every surface he was paid to clean. He did not rush. He did not linger. He worked through the remainder of his shift the way a man works when he has decided that the work itself is a form of integrity. By 3:10 in the morning, the upper floors were quiet. He rode the elevator down to the basement, returned his cart, changed back into his street clothes in the locker room. Luis had already left. Yolanda was still finishing the lobby level. He could hear the buffer humming somewhere in the distance. Dmitri had left a half-eaten sandwich on the break room table with a note in Ukrainian that Ethan could read, and which said, essentially, "I got hungry. Don't judge me." He smiled at that. He threw away the wrapper. He gathered his bag. On the walk to the subway, the city was doing what it did at 3 a.m. in March, offering a cold, clear air that felt almost country-like in its cleanness, the streets scrubbed by the hour into something near silence. A cab moved west on 52nd. A man in a restaurant uniform walked east with both hands in his pockets. Somewhere, a truck made the sound of a truck reversing, that persistent mechanical beeping that was the city's odd version of a night bird. Ethan walked with his hands in his pockets and his bag over one shoulder, and he thought about the Chinese delegate's face, the specific moment when recognition had replaced frustration, when the man had understood that someone had finally understood him. He thought about the Arabic representative leaning forward into the table. He thought about the quality of silence in the room in the moment just before he'd spoken, that particular compressed silence of a space holding its breath. He thought about Charlotte Hayes and the way she had looked at him when he walked out. He got on the C train and opened his Swahili grammar and read until his stop. He did not allow himself to think about what, if anything, would happen next. He had learned this discipline through years of practice. Do not spend energy on outcomes you can't control. The decision had been made in the service corridor. It had been executed in the conference room. Whatever it meant or didn't mean was not something he could manage from a subway car at 3:30 in the morning. He got home at 4:05. Emma was asleep. The bird was on the ceiling. He lay down and was asleep in under 4 minutes. He dreamed in French. Hotet. The next morning was Wednesday, which meant Emma had her weekly library period, which she treated with an enthusiasm she otherwise reserved exclusively for thunderstorms and the occasional documentary about ocean life. She came to breakfast already talking about a book she intended to borrow, explaining its plot in enough detail that Ethan concluded she had essentially already written a review of it in her head on the walk from her room to the kitchen. "It's about a girl who discovers her grandmother was a spy," Emma said, accepting her plate without looking at it, already deep in the narration. "Not like a movie spy. A real kind of spy, where you do quiet things and nobody notices." Ethan poured coffee. "What kind of quiet things?" "Like translating documents and listening in on conversations and remembering them." She paused, a piece of egg halfway to her mouth. "Is that a real thing? Like, did real people do that?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Linguists were some of the most valuable intelligence assets in history. Wars were won and lost on translation. Emma set down her fork. This was her signal that a topic had become serious enough to deserve full attention. Really? Really? There are historians who argue that certain World War II operations succeeded or failed entirely on the quality of the interpreters involved. He sat down across from her. Language isn't just communication, it's access. It determines what you know, what you can see, what room you're allowed to be in. Emma was quiet for a moment, in her particular way of absorbing information before responding. Then she said, "That's why you learned so many." Ethan looked at her, his daughter, 8 years old, with her mother's face and a mind that moved with the precision of something that had been very carefully made. "Partly," he said. "What's the other part?" He thought about Henry Chen. He thought about the retired French teacher, Madame Fortier, who had lived on the second floor of his first apartment building in the Bronx, and who had been 81 years old and still read Le Monde every morning in print because she had no interest in, as she put it, the internet's approach to the news. He thought about the late-night Arabic broadcasts he'd found on an AM frequency at 2 in the morning during the months after Sarah died, when he couldn't sleep, when the specific sound of a language he didn't know had been a kind of mercy, something to focus on besides the silence. "Some of them I learned because I was lonely," he said honestly. "And learning a language is a way of reaching toward someone." Emma picked up her fork again. She considered this. "That makes sense," she said, and went back to her eggs. He was halfway through his afternoon errands, laundromat, pharmacy, the grocery store, to replace the bread, when his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. A Midtown area code. He stood in the bread aisle and looked at it. He answered. "Mr. Cole?" The voice was precise, professional, female. "This is Rebecca Marsh, executive assistant to Charlotte Hayes at Meridian International Group. Ms. Hayes would like to schedule a meeting with you at your earliest convenience. Would you be available to come to the office on Thursday at 2 p.m.? Ethan stood very still in the bread aisle. Around him, a woman deliberated between 2 brands of sourdough. A child asked a question in Spanish about crackers. The store's overhead music played something soft and forgotten. "I have a shift Thursday evening," he said. "Ms. Hayes anticipated the scheduling difficulty and wanted me to let you know that she will of course accommodate whatever time works best for you." There was a quality to that sentence. The CEO who will accommodate whatever time works best for the cleaning staff member said. That Ethan turned over briefly in his mind before setting it aside. 2 p.m. Thursday is fine, he said. "I can make that work." "Wonderful. Please come to the main reception on 40 and let them know you're there for a meeting with Ms. Hayes. They'll be expecting you." He thanked her. He hung up. He stood in the bread aisle for a moment longer than was strictly necessary to select a loaf. Then he picked up the bread and went to pay. He told no one about the phone call. This was not a considered decision so much as an instinct. The same instinct that had kept him from discussing the events of Tuesday night with anyone on the cleaning crew had kept him from replaying the moment in the conference room with the relish that part of him, honestly, wanted to indulge in. He had learned that the world had a way of deflating things. You spoke aloud before they were finished becoming real. He preferred to wait. Wednesday night's shift was routine in the way that all shifts following the extraordinary are routine, conspicuously, almost aggressively ordinary, as though the building itself was establishing that Tuesday had been an anomaly and the correct state of things was floors and surfaces and bins and the quiet hum of the buffer on the executive corridor. He cleaned floor 40 with particular thoroughness. The conference suite had been reset, the flags removed, the interpretation equipment collected, the table returned to its baseline state of polished expectation. Whatever had happened in this room 2 days ago had left no visible trace. Yolanda caught him standing in the doorway of the empty conference room at 10:30. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said. She looked at him with the frankness of a woman who had been observing people for 19 years in the intimate, unguarded hours of the night shift and knew the difference between fine and fine. "Something happened Tuesday," she said. It wasn't a question. He considered, then, "I helped with something. In the summit." Yolanda's eyes went to the conference room, then back to him. "Helped how?" "Translation," he said. A pause. "You went in there?" They were losing the whole negotiation over a mistranslation. I knew what was actually being said. He shrugged, a minimal gesture. So I knocked on the door. Yolanda stared at him. He had known Yolanda for 3 years, and in that time he had seen her surprised approximately twice. Ethan, her voice had a quality he couldn't quite categorize. Did it work? I think so. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she exhaled through her nose, a sound that contained something between exasperation and admiration. And what? They just let you in? Security didn't throw you out? Almost, he said. The CEO gave me 60 seconds. 60 seconds, Yolanda repeated. It was enough time to start. Another long look. Then Yolanda put her hands on her hips, which was her gesture of arriving at a conclusion. I've been telling people for 3 years, she said, that you were not a regular person. I'm a regular person, Ethan said. Regular people don't speak 8 languages and clean floors at midnight, Ethan. Regular people don't do that. She shook her head. What happens now? I have a meeting Thursday, he said, with the CEO. The sound Yolanda made then was not a word exactly. It was more like a compressed acknowledgement of the entire situation. Its improbability, its rightness, the specific complex satisfaction of watching something long invisible finally become seen. Well, she said, and returned to her cart. Thursday arrived with the muted, overcast efficiency of a New York March day that had no interest in aesthetics. Ethan dropped Emma at school, came home, and stood in front of his closet for longer than he had stood in front of it in recent memory. His wardrobe was not extensive. It was composed of his work uniforms, a small collection of practical, everyday clothes, and at the back of the closet, preserved from a previous version of his life, 2 dress shirts and a pair of dark slacks that Sarah had bought him for a friend's wedding when he was 26. He hadn't worn them since the funeral. He took out the dark slacks. He examined them. They still fit, approximately. He was thinner now than he'd been at 26, life and the years of physical work having removed certain softnesses and replaced them with something more angular. He ironed the better of the 2 dress shirts, a deep navy blue that Emma, on the occasion she'd seen it in the closet, had called your important shirt. He dressed. He looked in the bathroom mirror. He looked, he thought, like a man who had been assembled from the best available materials by someone working with a limited budget. But he looked clean and careful and himself, and that was enough. He took the subway to Midtown, arrived at 1:45, and stood on the sidewalk outside the main entrance of Harmon Tower. The front entrance, the one with the marble floors and the suited security men. The entrance he had walked past every workday for 3 years without going through. He went through. The lobby was everything the service entrance was not. High ceilings with the kind of architectural intention that required significant money to execute. The sculpture Emma had asked about stood in the center, 12 feet of brushed steel, asymmetric and absorbing, exactly as he'd described it. It did look different from every angle. He paused beside it for a moment on his way to the security desk. Ethan Cole, he told the suited guard. I have a 2 o'clock with Charlotte Hayes. The guard checked something on a screen, nodded. Ms. Hayes' assistant will be right down. He waited. He stood in the lobby of Harmon Tower at 1:52 p.m. on a Thursday in his important shirt, and he waited. Rebecca Marsh was a woman in her mid-40s with the brisk, competent energy of someone who managed complexity the way other people breathed, continuously, without apparent effort. She collected him from the lobby with a warm efficiency, and they rode the elevator to 42 in a companionable quiet. Ms. Hayes is finishing a call, Rebecca said. She'll be with you in just a few minutes. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee? Water would be great, thank you. He was shown to a waiting area outside the CEO's office, a sitting area with the kind of low, angular furniture that looked designed rather than comfortable, positioned beside a window with the view of Midtown that he had stood before many times from the other side of the glass, from the corridor, from the invisible side. From this side, it was exactly the same view. He sat and waited and looked at the city. He thought about what he wanted from this meeting. This was a thing he'd been turning over carefully since Wednesday. Not what he hoped for, not what he feared, but what he actually wanted, which was a different and more precise question. He wanted to be taken seriously, not celebrated, not rewarded necessarily, but seen with accuracy, seen as the person he actually was, with the capacities he actually possessed. He had wanted this for a long time. He had stopped expecting it from this particular context approximately 2.5 years into his tenure at Harmon Tower, somewhere around the time a mid-level manager on the 39th floor had spoken to him with the comfortable default condescension of someone who had never considered that the man cleaning his office might have an interior life more complex than his own. Ethan had cleaned the office. He had not said anything. He had filed it away in the particular internal archive where he kept things he was not going to let diminish him. "Mr. Cole?" He looked up. Rebecca was in the doorway of the office. "Miss Hayes will see you now." Brad. The office of the CEO of Meridian International Group was large and ordered and looked like the workspace of someone who was genuinely deeply occupied. Not the performed busyness of a person managing appearances, but the real kind, where multiple active projects occupied the desk at once, and the bookshelves contained working texts rather than decorative ones. Ethan noticed these things in the 3 seconds it took him to cross from the doorway to the chair in front of the desk. The way he noticed most things. Not obviously, but completely. Charlotte Hayes stood up when he came in. This small formality, standing to receive a man who cleaned the floors of her building, was not lost on him. He noted it without expression. "Mr. Cole," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming." Her handshake was firm and direct. She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and they both sat. For a moment, she simply looked at him. Not in the way of the guard at the conference room door, not in the way of the mid-level manager on 39, not with assessment calibrated to uniform and badge, with something more complex. She looked the way people look when they are trying to reconcile two versions of the same thing and finding the reconciliation both necessary and difficult. "I owe you an apology," she said. He hadn't expected that. His expression didn't change, but something recalibrated internally. "For what?" he said. "For 60 seconds, she said. "When you came to that door, I gave you 60 seconds. She paused. "I want to be honest with you about what that means. 60 seconds is what I gave you because of what you were wearing, because of the badge on your chest. If you had walked through that door in a suit and told me the same thing, I would have listened immediately." She met his eyes steadily. "That's a bias I acted on, and I want to name it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You still let me in," he said. "Barely," she said, "and too slowly." 60 seconds was enough time to start. "You shouldn't have needed to work with 60 seconds. She leaned forward slightly. "You walked into a room with 12 professional interpreters and corrected a failure that nearly cost this company a $100 million partnership. You did it in 8 languages over 18 minutes, and then you picked up your cart and finished the floors." She paused. "I need to ask you something." "Okay. Why haven't you told anyone about the languages, about what you can do?" Ethan looked at the window for a moment, at the midtown skyline beyond the glass, at the city he had been moving through in the invisible hours, doing invisible work. "I have," he said. "I told the building services manager when I was hired that I had a linguistics background. I mentioned it once to a floor supervisor who was struggling to communicate with a Brazilian contractor." "What happened?" "Nothing," he said simply. "It wasn't information that fit the category I was in." Charlotte absorbed this. She turned her pen over in her hands twice, a gesture he recognized from Tuesday as a thinking habit rather than a nervous one. "Tell me about the languages," she said. "How you learned them, all of them." And so he told her. He told her about Henry Chen and 4 years of Mandarin built out of arguments about economics and education and the Cultural Revolution and the best way to prepare fish. He told her about Madame Fortier on the 2nd floor of the Bronx apartment, who had been a professor of literature at the University of Lyon before emigrating in 1967, and who had charged him $0 for French lessons in exchange for reading aloud to her on Tuesday afternoons because her eyesight was failing and she found audiobooks without texture. He told her about learning Spanish from his grandmother's sister in Trinidad over the summers of his childhood, and Portuguese from a soccer broadcast he'd started following because the analyst's commentary was so different in texture from the English coverage that it seemed like a different sport. He told her about Arabic, the late-night AM frequency, the newsstand owner, 2 years of study that had begun as insomnia management and ended as fluency, German, from a textbook and a correspondence course, and a pen pal exchange program through a community center that had paired him with a retired schoolteacher in Hamburg named Gerhard, who wrote 3-page letters about city planning and local politics, and who was still, technically, a pen pal, though the correspondence had slowed. Japanese from a night class at a community college he'd attended while Sarah was still alive, and from a Japanese language film series at the local library that he had attended every month for 2 years. He told her all of this. Charlotte listened without interruption. She did not take notes. She listened the way he imagined she negotiated, completely, with full attention. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You were accepted into a linguistics program," she said. It wasn't a question. Someone had done some preparation for this meeting. "Columbia," he said. "Graduate program. Computational linguistics with a focus on cross-cultural interpretation theory." He said it without particular affect because the time for particular affect about that had long passed. "You didn't go." "My wife got sick," he said. "She died 8 months later. I had a 3-year-old daughter." Charlotte was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it simply, without the hedging or the performance that apologies sometimes come wrapped in. Just the 2 words, direct and real. "Thank you," he said. "The same way." She turned the pen over once more. Then she set it down on the desk. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He had considered this possibility. He would be dishonest with himself if he claimed otherwise. On the subway ride over, standing outside the front entrance on the sidewalk, waiting in the lobby beside the sculpture, he had turned the possibility over with the careful hands of a man who had been disappointed by things he'd reached for before and had learned to hold open questions gently. But hearing it said aloud was different. It landed in him with a weight he hadn't quite prepared for. "What position?" he said, and was proud of how steady the 2 words came out. Charlotte leaned forward. "I want to create a role for you. Director of International Communications. It would involve managing all of Meridian's multilingual communications, summit preparation, real-time interpretation, cross-cultural advisory for international negotiations, review and quality control of our translation contractors." She held his gaze. "It's a role we should have had for years and didn't, because I didn't think about it the right way. Tuesday clarified some things." Ethan sat with this. "My languages are conversational in some areas," he said. "Technical financial language in Mandarin, for instance. I'm functional but not expert level in specialized terminology." "I don't need you to be a financial attorney," Charlotte said. "I need someone who understands how meaning moves between cultures, how intention becomes words, and what happens to that intention when it passes through translation. I have attorneys and analysts. I don't have anyone who understands the room the way you understand the room." He turned this over, examined it, looked for the place where it became a different thing than it appeared to be. He didn't find one. "The salary," he said, "and the hours. I'll have Rebecca send you the formal offer document before you leave today. The salary is significant. I want to be direct about that, because I think directness is owed. The hours are flexible. I understand you have a daughter. She's 8, he said. She needs me at school pickup 3 days a week, and there are mornings that are non-negotiable." "Non-negotiable is a phrase I understand," Charlotte said, and the corner of her mouth moved in the very slight way of someone who has found something genuinely wry. "The mornings and the school pickup are preserved. Whatever you need." Ethan was quiet for 10 seconds. He looked at the desk, and then at the window, and then back at Charlotte Hayes. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Please." "Why me, specifically?" He kept his voice level. "There are professional interpreters in this city with formal credentials, institutional training, professional references. People who speak 8 languages and have the resume that documents it. Why not hire one of them?" Charlotte looked at him. She appeared to consider the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than deflecting it. "2 reasons," she said. "The first is that Tuesday demonstrated something that credentials don't guarantee. Not just fluency, but judgment. You assessed the room from the outside. You identified 3 compounding errors. You knew which one to address first, and in which language, and in what register. You walked into a room with 12 professional interpreters and did something none of them could do. That combination of skill and judgment and situational reading, that's not something you find in a resume." "And the second reason?" Ethan said. She met his eyes. "Because you knocked on the door," she said, "when it would have been considerably easier and considerably safer for you to keep walking. You knocked on the door, and that tells me something about what kind of person I'd be working with." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved in its millions of simultaneous directions, unaware of this particular stillness on the 42nd floor, where a man who had spent 3 years invisible was deciding whether to let himself be seen. "Okay," Ethan said. Charlotte raised an eyebrow slightly. "Okay, yes?" she said. "Okay, yes," he said. He was in the lobby by 3:15, offer document in a clean white envelope in his hand. Rebecca's card clipped to it with the instruction to call with any questions, standard start date flexibility offered, benefits package summarized on the second page. He stood beside the sculpture in the center of the lobby. He stood where Emma could have stood if she'd come on a Saturday to see the thing that looked different from every angle. He turned the envelope over in his hands. From the left, the sculpture looked like it was reaching upward. From where he stood now, slightly to the right and back, it looked like it was folding inward, into itself, turning towards something at its own center. He thought about Emma's banana smiles and accommodation written 5 times in careful printing and everything folded in his chest pocket over his heart. He thought about what it meant to reach towards something across all the distance that had accumulated between who he was and who he had been heading toward, before life had rerouted him through grief and night shifts and a water stain that looked like a sparrow trying to take flight. He walked out of the front entrance of Harmon Tower into the cold March afternoon, envelope in hand, and stood on the sidewalk where the people of Midtown moved past him in their dozens of directions. He took out his phone and did something he almost never did at this hour on a school day. He called Emma. Mrs. Delgado would have picked her up by now. She'd be home, doing homework, being sternly efficient about it because that was how Emma approached most things. It rang twice. "Dad?" Her voice slightly cautious, slightly alert. "You never call in the afternoon. Is everything okay?" "Everything's okay," he said. "I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause on the line. He could hear in the background the faint sounds of their apartment, the pipes, the specific creak of the kitchen chair. "Are you sure?" Emma said. "I'm sure," he said. Another pause. "Okay," she said, with the tone of someone filing a data point for later analysis. Then, "Dad?" "Yeah?" "The bird on the ceiling." "What about it?" "I think it's not trying to fly away," Emma said. "I think it's trying to fly back, like toward something." He stood on the sidewalk of 52nd Street in March and said nothing for a moment. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think you're right." He could hear her smile, even without seeing it. "Come home soon," she said, and hung up. He put the phone in his pocket. He put the envelope carefully inside his jacket, against his chest, beside the folded note that was still there. He turned up his collar against the cold, and he walked toward the subway, toward home, carrying the weight of being seen for the first time in a long time, which was heavier than invisibility, he was discovering, and also, completely and entirely, better. The offer document sat on the kitchen table for 2 days. Not because Ethan was uncertain. The decision had been made on the sidewalk outside Harmon Tower, had perhaps been made in the service corridor before he ever knocked on the door, but because he wanted to read it carefully, the way he read everything carefully, without the distortion that urgency or excitement could introduce. He read each page twice. He looked up 3 terms in the contract language that he wanted to understand precisely, rather than approximately. He examined the benefits schedule, the salary structure, the title, and its organizational placement within Meridian's hierarchy. Then on the second evening, Friday, after Emma was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with the document and a pen and signed his name on the last page. Ethan Cole. Just the 2 words, the same as his badge, except that now the rest of him was included. He put the document back in the envelope, sealed it, and set it beside his coffee maker next to the Swahili grammar, which was still open to the chapter on irregular verbs. He sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet. Outside, Mr. Okonkwo's television was audible through the wall, some late-night program with a laughing audience. The pipes knocked once, their standard evening communication. The refrigerator hummed its steady, indifferent note. He thought about calling his aunt in Trinidad, the one remaining family member who had known him long enough to understand the full shape of where he'd been. He decided against it, not because he didn't want to share it, but because he wanted to hold it a little longer in the private space before it became a story he told. There was something that still felt fragile about it, the way new things sometimes did before they had fully arrived. He went to bed at 11:30. He did not dream. Emma found out on Saturday morning. This was not entirely planned. Ethan had been trying to find the right moment, the right words, the right way to explain something to an 8-year-old that involved a significant change in the architecture of their daily life. But Emma had a quality that complicated deliberate timing. She noticed everything, filed it away with the systematic efficiency of a researcher, and eventually produced her observations at moments of her own choosing. Saturday morning, she came into the kitchen, looked at the signed envelope on the counter, looked at her father at the stove, and said, "What's that?" Ethan turned the eggs. "Sit down," he said. "I'll explain after breakfast." Emma sat. She looked at the envelope again. She looked at him. "Is it something bad?" she asked. "No? Something good?" "I think so." She appeared to decide this was sufficient for the moment and applied herself to her orange juice with the patience of someone who had learned that her father delivered information at his own pace, and that attempting to accelerate this was generally unproductive. After breakfast, he slid the envelope across the table to her. "You can open it," he said. She opened it with careful hands, the way she handled things she understood to be important, and unfolded the document. She read slowly, with her finger moving beneath the lines, which was a habit she'd had since first grade that she'd never lost. The room was very quiet. After 2 minutes, she looked up. "Director of International Communications," she read, "at Meridian International Group." She looked at him. "The building." "Yes, your building." "It will be," he said. Emma put the document down flat on the table in front of her and looked at it. Her face was doing the complex, careful processing that he had learned to wait out, the surface stillness that meant significant internal work was occurring. "You won't clean the floors anymore," she said. "No." "You'll wear a suit." "Probably." She was quiet again. Then she said very precisely, "Are you scared?" The question landed with the accuracy of something fired by a person who knew exactly where the target was. Ethan considered giving her a reassuring answer. He decided against it. "A little," he said. "Yes." Emma nodded slowly. This appeared to satisfy her in a way that a purely reassuring answer might not have. She picked up the document, folded it carefully back along its original creases, and placed it in the envelope with the gravity of someone completing a formal task. Then she slid it back across the table to him. "You knocked on the door even when you were scared," she said. "You can do this too." He looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She was 8 years old and had Sarah's face, and she had just said the exact right thing with the exact right economy, and for a moment he couldn't speak, not because he was sad, but because he was the opposite of sad, and it required a second to absorb. "I can," he said. Emma picked up her glass. "Can I get a new backpack?" she said. "Mine has a broken zipper." He laughed. The laughter came up from somewhere deep and real, the kind that's been stored for a while. "Yes," he said. "You can get a new backpack." His last shift at Harmon Tower was the following Tuesday night. He hadn't announced it, hadn't made any ceremony of it, but Yolanda found out, the way Yolanda found out everything related to the cleaning crew, through a network of information exchange that Ethan had long suspected was more sophisticated than the company's actual communications infrastructure. She appeared beside his card at 9:30 on the 39th floor. "Tuesday night is your last night," she said. "Yes," he said. "You could have told me yourself." "I was going to." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she found simultaneously predictable and exasperating. "When? When you were cleaning out your locker?" He acknowledged this with a slight tilt of his head. "Fair point." "I'm happy for you, Ethan," she said, and the sincerity in it was complete. No qualification, no hedge, just the clean statement of a person who meant it entirely. "I want you to know that." "Thank you, Yolanda." "I also want you to know," she continued, "that I told Luis 2 years ago that you were going to end up doing something that made people feel foolish for not having noticed you sooner." "You told him that?" I absolutely told him that. She adjusted her gloves with the efficiency of someone who had a schedule to maintain. He didn't believe me. He owes me $10. Ethan smiled. I won't say anything. Don't. She picked up her mop. But don't disappear either, you understand me? The building services people aren't invisible just because the executives treat them that way. You know that now more than most. Don't let the new floors make you forget the ones you came from. He looked at her. 19 years of this building. 19 years of knowing what every floor smelled like at midnight, of learning the specific geography of the city through its carpet fibers and its glass surfaces and the things people left behind when they thought no one was watching. I won't, he said. She nodded once. Good. And she went back to work. Luis, when Ethan found him on 40, stopped his work entirely and shook Ethan's hand with both of his. The kind of handshake that means something different from a regular handshake. That means, I see you and I'm glad, and go do that thing all at once. Dmitri, communicating entirely through eyebrows, managed to convey what appeared to be congratulations, mild envy, and genuine warmth in approximately 4 seconds. Ethan finished the floors. He cleaned every surface with the same attention he had always brought to them. He made the executive corridor shine. He cleaned the conference suite on 40. The room with the 8 flags, now empty, reset, waiting for its next moment of consequence. And he stood at the center of it for a moment before he left, in the low amber light, and he looked at the dark wood table and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the city beyond the glass. He thought, I was in this room. I changed what happened in this room. Not the cleaning, the other thing. He picked up his card and went to the elevator for the last time. The first day of his new position was the following Monday. He was up at 5:30, not because he needed to be. His start time was 9, civilized, the kind of hour that acknowledged the existence of mornings rather than treating them as obstacles. But because old habits lived in the body, and 5:30 was where his body believed the day began. He made breakfast. He did Emma's braids. He went through her spelling words for Thursday's test, which now included international and negotiation, a coincidence that Emma found either amusing or meaningful depending on her mood, which was currently ambivalent about mornings. International has 5 syllables, she said, testing the word. Say it as 4 chunks, Ethan said. Internation all. The 5th one sneaks in. She wrote it carefully. International. Examined it. Why is it spelled like that? French root, he said. Most of the complicated English spellings come from French or Latin. When the Normans invaded England in 1066, they brought their vocabulary with them, and it layered over the existing Anglo-Saxon. Emma looked up at him over the paper. Dad. Yes? I love you, but it's 7 a.m. He smiled. Sorry. No, you're not. No, he admitted. I'm not. She went back to her spelling. He stood at the counter and looked at himself in the small mirror beside the kitchen window, the one he'd hung years ago because the bathroom was too small for morning organization. He was wearing the dark slacks and the navy shirt, Emma's important shirt, and he had his jacket over the back of his chair, and he looked like himself in a slightly alternate version. The same face, the same eyes that Sarah used to say, had the quality of a person who was always listening to something at a frequency other people couldn't hear. The same man who had learned Mandarin from a grocery store owner and French from an old professor and Arabic from late-night radio, and who had carried all of it quietly through 3 years of midnight floors. Just in different clothes now, just going through a different door. Rebecca Marsh met him at the main entrance at 8:55 and walked him through what she called the practical geography of the 42nd floor. The layout of the executive offices, the conference facilities, the shared spaces, the organizational logic of the building from the inside rather than the outside. His office was on the 42nd floor. This registered somewhere in him as a fact that required a second to settle. Not the office itself, not its size or its view, but the floor. 42. The floor he had cleaned 3 times a week for 3 years. The floor he had known in the dark, in the quiet, from the invisible side of every surface. The office had a window facing west. Not the full panoramic view of Charlotte's corner office, but a genuine window, a real piece of the city, buildings and sky, and the specific afternoon light that would fall through it at 3 o'clock on a clear day. There was a desk, clean and bare, waiting. On it, Rebecca had placed a printed schedule for his first week: meetings, orientation sessions, introductions to the teams he'd be working with. There was also, he noticed, a copy of Meridian's current portfolio of international partnerships, a thick document with a list of countries, active projects, ongoing negotiations, scheduled summits. He stood in the office and looked at the desk and the window and the document. He thought about the service corridor, the frosted glass, the moment of decision. He sat down. He opened the portfolio document to the first page and began to read. The first person who came to find him that morning, besides Rebecca, was a man named James Whitfield, Meridian's head of legal affairs, mid-50s, silver-haired, with the bearing of someone who had spent a significant portion of his career in rooms where the stakes were high and the language was precise. He knocked on the open office door at 10:15. "Mr. Cole," he said. "James Whitfield, legal." Ethan stood. They shook hands. Whitfield's grip was measured and professional. "I wanted to come by personally," Whitfield said. "I was in the room Tuesday." "I know," Ethan said. "You were at the far end of the table, Australian delegation side." Whitfield blinked. Then, with the slight recalibration of a man reassessing rapidly, "That's correct." "Please sit down," Ethan said. Whitfield sat. He looked around the office with the brief, encompassing survey of a man who noticed things and filed them. "I'll be direct with you," Whitfield said. "I'm not someone who adjusts easily to unusual circumstances. I've been with Meridian for 11 years, and I have a strong preference for established processes." "That's useful information," Ethan said. "What I'm telling you," Whitfield continued, "is that my initial reaction to Tuesday's events was skepticism. Not about what you did, the result speaks for itself, but about the position Charlotte has created. A director of international communications reporting directly to the CEO, without the typical recruitment process, without the institutional vetting. That's a significant departure from how we do things." Ethan looked at him. Whitfield held his gaze with the steadiness of a man who had made a career out of saying difficult things to important people. "You're not sure about me," Ethan said. "I'm not sure about the process," Whitfield said. "The distinction matters. I don't know you yet. I try not to form conclusions about people I don't know yet." Ethan considered this. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he respected it. Whitfield was not being hostile. He was being precise, which was different. "What would help?" Ethan said. Whitfield seemed to appreciate the directness. He leaned forward slightly. "I have a situation that's been causing problems for 3 weeks. Korean partners, the sole contingent on the Incheon logistics project. There's a contractual language dispute that our Korean-speaking contractors have been unable to fully resolve because it involves a specific legal term that translates differently in South Korean commercial law than in U.S. commercial law, and the contractors don't have the background to navigate the distinction." "What's the term?" Ethan said. Whitfield opened the folder he'd brought and slid a single page across the desk. On it was a paragraph of Korean text with the disputed term underlined. Ethan read it. He read it once, quickly, for content, then once more slowly, for register and legal connotation. He was aware of Whitfield watching him, not intrusively, but attentively, in the way of someone conducting an honest assessment. "The term is ihangbo joja," Ethan said. Literally, it translates as something like performance assistant or auxiliary performer. But in Korean commercial law, its operative meaning is closer to a subcontractor with specific liability protections that don't exist in the equivalent U.S. legal category. Your contractors are translating it literally, which produces a term in English that doesn't carry the legal implications the Korean side intends. He looked up. The Korean partners aren't disputing the contract terms. They're trying to communicate a specific liability structure that the translation is stripping out. They probably think the U.S. side is being deliberately evasive. Whitfield was very still. "And the fix?" he said. "You need a contractual addendum that defines the term specifically for this agreement, establishes its operative meaning in both legal systems, and confirms that the liability protections the Korean side is referencing are explicitly acknowledged." Ethan paused. "I can draft the language for the addendum in both English and Korean, if that would be useful." You'd need a Korean commercial attorney to verify the legal accuracy, but the linguistic framework would give them something to work from. Whitfield looked at him for a long moment, the kind of long moment that Ethan had learned to sit with rather than fill. Yes, Whitfield said finally. That would be very useful. He gathered his folder, stood, extended his hand again. Mr. Cole, he said, I'll reserve my final conclusions for later, but I'm revising my initial position. That seems reasonable, Ethan said. Whitfield allowed himself the small, precise smile of a man who had found more than he'd come looking for. It does, doesn't it? He nodded once and left. Ethan turned back to the portfolio document. He found the section on the Incheon Logistics project, read for 12 minutes, then opened a new document on his computer and began drafting the addendum language. He worked through lunch without noticing. Charlotte Hayes found him at 2 p.m, still at the desk. She appeared in the doorway without announcement. He got the impression this was standard practice for her, that she moved through her own building without the formal protocols that might slow down observation. And she stood there for a moment before he looked up. How's the first day? She asked. Whitfield came by this morning, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Early. He had a Korean contract problem. Liability terminology dispute that's been unresolved for 3 weeks. He turned his monitor slightly toward her. I drafted an addendum framework. He'll need Korean commercial counsel to verify, but the linguistic architecture is there. Charlotte came to the desk and read the screen. She read it the way she did most things, quickly but completely, without performance. James Whitfield has had that contract problem for 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks of Korean partners thinking we were being deliberately obtuse. Yes. And you solved it in a morning. Identified the source and built a framework for the solution, he said. There's a distinction. She looked at him. You're going to be very annoying to argue with, aren't you? I try to be accurate, he said. Some people find that annoying, yes. The corner of her mouth moved. It was becoming a familiar expression. The almost smile that registered genuine amusement in a face that was otherwise predominantly composed. He was beginning to develop a taxonomy of Charlotte Hayes's expressions, the way you developed a working knowledge of a new language, incrementally, through repeated exposure, building meaning from context. Come to the conference room at 3, she said. I want you to sit in on a call with the Mexico City office. Our liaison there has been having communication difficulty with the local development partners, and I want another set of ears in the room. I'll be there, he said. She turned to go, paused. Ethan. He looked up. James Whitfield came to your office on your first day, she said. He comes to almost no one's office. He makes people come to him. She paused as though deciding whether to continue. For what it's worth. He took this in. Thank you, he said. She nodded and left. The Mexico City call was at 3, as promised. 7 people in the conference room, Charlotte at the head, 2 people from Meridian's development division, a contract specialist from legal, Rebecca managing the technical setup, and Ethan in a chair slightly back from the main table, the posture of someone there to observe rather than present. The call connected. On the screen, 4 people appeared from what appeared to be a glass-walled office with Reforma Avenue visible through the windows behind them. Mexico City at midday. The light different there, sharper and more golden. The Meridian liaison, a man named Gerald Park, American-born, who'd been posted to the Mexico City office for 2 years, introduced the local partners in accented Spanish that was technically correct and culturally approximate, which was the specific gap between competence and fluency that Ethan had heard thousands of times and always recognized immediately. The partners responded in Spanish. Gerald translated. Ethan listened. Gerald was doing a creditable job. He was missing nuance, missing register, missing the specific quality of the lead partner's phrasing that suggested he was considerably more concerned about a timeline issue than his translated words conveyed, but he was doing a creditable job. Ethan did not interrupt. He took notes on the pad in front of him. After 20 minutes, there was a break in the call. The Mexico City partners stepped away briefly, and Charlotte looked at Ethan. Impressions? She said. The lead partner, the one in the blue jacket, is more worried about the February timeline than Gerald is conveying. His Spanish has the specific hedging structure that indicates he's managing a problem he hasn't disclosed yet. My read is that there's a local permitting issue or a subcontractor problem that he's characterizing as a minor delay because he doesn't want to escalate it to the U.S. side prematurely. Ethan looked at his notes. Also, the woman on his right, E.T.'s, she hasn't spoken, but her body language and her two off-camera comments to the man beside her suggest she has a specific technical concern that no one has created space for her to raise. The room was quiet. The contract specialist, a young woman named Janitor, who had been with the company for 18 months, looked at Ethan with an expression of focused recalibration. "You got all that from the call," she said. "Language isn't just words," he said. "It's also what people build around the words when the words aren't enough." Charlotte looked at the screen, at the empty chairs of the Mexico City office, while the partners were away. "When they come back," she said to Ethan, "I'd like you to address them directly. In Spanish, ask the woman in the group what she'd like to contribute to the discussion." Gerald Park, on screen, who could hear the conference room through the open connection, looked slightly startled by this. "Charlotte," Ethan said quietly, "Gerald has been building these relationships for 2 years. If I come in over his head, it complicates his position." She looked at him, processed this. "How do you suggest we handle it?" "Let me coach Gerald through the next segment. He asks the woman the question. I'll feed him the phrasing." He paused. "It's slower and less precise, but it preserves the relationship architecture he's built. And relationship architecture is harder to rebuild than a single call is to optimize." Charlotte was still for a moment. "All right," she said. When the Mexico City partners returned, Gerald Park, following Ethan's quiet guidance from off-screen, turned to the woman in the group and asked, in carefully adjusted Spanish, for her perspective on the technical components of the project. The woman looked briefly surprised at being addressed. Then she leaned forward and she began to speak. She spoke for 4 minutes. Her concern was specific, technical, and significant. A structural assessment discrepancy in the engineering reports that she had been trying to raise for 6 weeks, and that had been sidelined in every meeting by the momentum of the men in the room. Gerald translated, haltingly. Ethan wrote rapid clarifying notes and passed them across the table to the contract specialist. By the end of the call, the structural issue was on the formal record, a review was scheduled, and the lead partner had, with evident relief, disclosed the subcontractor delay he'd been managing. The call ended. The room sat for a moment with the specific quality of air after something has been opened that needed to be opened. Janitor was looking at her notes. "She'd been trying to raise that for 6 weeks, she said quietly. 6 weeks. "Yes," Ethan said. Charlotte was looking at the blank screen. "What happens to deals," she said slowly, "when the voices that need to be heard can't get heard?" "The same thing that almost happened Tuesday," Ethan said. She turned to look at him, and in her expression was something that he was beginning to understand was not just respect for what he could do, but a genuine and growing consideration of what she hadn't understood before he walked through the door. About language, about visibility, about all the rooms where the wrong people were speaking and the right people were waiting to be asked. He gathered his notes and said nothing more, because the room didn't need more. Some moments earned their own silence. He picked Emma up from school that afternoon, the 3:15 pickup, the one Mrs. Delgado usually handled, which he had made possible by leaving the office at 2:45 with Charlotte's nod and Rebecca's quiet notation in the calendar. Emma came through the school doors in the stream of children and immediately clocked him standing at the gate, which took her 2 seconds, and then she walked toward him with the specific gait of a child trying very hard not to run. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She looked at him in his jacket and his important shirt, backpack over one shoulder, and he could see her doing the recalibration. The same face, the same father, slightly different packaging. "How was it?" she said. "The first day." He took her backpack and they started walking toward the subway. The March afternoon was still cold, but less aggressive than the previous week, with a quality of light that suggested spring was in the vicinity, even if it hadn't arrived yet. "Good," he said. "Really good." Emma walked beside him. She seemed to be thinking. "Did anyone treat you badly?" she asked. It was phrased with the directness of a child who had given the question prior consideration. One person was cautious, he said, but that's different from treating me badly. He was honest about his doubts, which I respect. And now? And now I think he's less doubtful. Emma nodded, satisfied with this calibration. They walked half a block in comfortable silence, which was one of the things Ethan loved most about his daughter. Her ease with silence, her lack of need to fill every space with sound. Then she said, I told my teacher today. Told her what? About you, about the summit, and the languages, and the new job. She paused. She asked me what my dad does for work, for the family history project. And I started to say cleaning staff, but then I thought, that's not wrong, but it's not the whole thing. Ethan walked beside her. What did you say? Emma tilted her head. I said you're a linguist, that you speak 8 languages, and you used to work nights so you could be there when I needed you, and now you're going to help companies understand each other better. She glanced up at him. Is that okay? He felt the familiar weight behind his sternum that arrived when Emma said something that was entirely, completely true. That's exactly right, he said. Miss Patterson said it sounded like a movie. What did you say? I said it was better than a movie because it actually happened. He looked at his daughter, walking beside him in the late afternoon light on a street in Harlem, with her new backpack to be determined and her serious face and her mother's eyes, and he thought about the sparrow on the ceiling trying to fly back towards something. Yeah, he said. It is. The subway entrance came up on their left. They went down the stairs together into the familiar underground heading home, but from a different direction now, from the front of the building rather than the back, through the door that had always been there, that had always been his. 3 months passed. Not quietly. Nothing about those 3 months was quiet exactly, but they passed with a kind of productive momentum that Ethan had almost forgotten was possible, the sensation of time moving in a direction rather than simply moving. The days organized themselves around work that required him fully, that used the whole of what he had and occasionally exceeded it, which was the condition he'd been built for without ever having been given the proper context in which to operate. He learned the company the way he learned languages, through immersion, through pattern recognition, through the patient accumulation of detail until structure emerged. He learned the organizational geography of Meridian's international partnerships, the Brazilian Logistics Consortium and the German Infrastructure Group and the Seoul Development Project and a dozen others, each with its own history, its own accumulated tensions, its own communication failures waiting to be mapped and addressed. He learned which of Meridian's relationships were genuinely healthy and which were performing health while concealing friction. He learned which meetings required him to say nothing and which required him to say the one precise thing at the one precise moment, and he learned to tell the difference. He sat in rooms that 2 years ago he had cleaned from the outside. He sat at the table where 8 national flags had stood in a row. He got the Incheon contract resolved. Whitfield's Korean liability problem, the addendum framework he'd drafted on his first morning, which went through 2 rounds of revision with the Korean commercial attorneys and was signed in the 4th week of his tenure, ending 3 months of stalled communication. Whitfield sent him a single-line email afterward. The Seoul partners called it the clearest contract language they'd seen from a U.S. counterpart in a decade. Well done. Ethan printed the email and put it in his desk drawer. Not from vanity. He was not a person who kept score in the ways that vanity requires, but because it was evidence of something working, and he liked to keep evidence close. The woman from the Mexico City call, her name, he learned eventually, was Valentina Cruz, and she was the lead structural engineer on the Incheon project's parallel development in Guadalajara, became someone he spoke with regularly. She was direct and technically precise, and had a quality of mind that he recognized and appreciated. She said exactly what she meant, and she meant what she said, in Spanish that was specific enough to be demanding and which he met without difficulty. She told him once, during a project review call, that she had spent a year and a half trying to get her engineering concerns into the formal record, and that the 2 minutes of being asked directly had been the first time she'd felt the communication working in both directions. He thought about that for a while, about how long someone could speak into a room before they stopped expecting to be heard. The hardest part of those 3 months was not the work. The hardest part was the internal recalibration, the deep, stubborn work of adjusting his self-conception to fit the new context. He had spent 3 years, and in some ways considerably longer than 3 years, learning to operate in invisibility. He had made it a skill, a discipline, a form of integrity. He had built a kind of dignity inside it that sustained him. And now the invisibility was gone, and he had to learn to occupy the visible space without either shrinking from it or being distorted by it, and this turned out to require more sustained effort than any of the languages he'd learned. There were meetings where he caught himself automatically positioning himself at the edges. There were conversations where his first instinct was to make his contribution brief, deferential, compressed, the way you spoke when you expected interruption. There were moments when someone deferred to him, asked his opinion with the genuine expectation of receiving it, and he had to consciously resist the reflex that still lived in him from 1,000 midnight corridors. Stay small, stay quiet. You're not supposed to be here. He worked on this privately, methodically, the way he worked on everything. He thought about Henry Chen, who had argued with everyone with complete conviction and had never once appeared to doubt his right to occupy a room fully. He thought about Madame Fortier, who at 81 had still lectured with the authoritative clarity of someone who had decided exactly how much space she was entitled to take up and had taken it precisely. He tried to import something of both of them into his posture, his voice, the quality of stillness he brought to a room. Slowly, incrementally, it worked. He began to arrive at meetings first and sit at the center of the table rather than the edge. He began to finish his sentences without checking the room for permission. He began to hold silences without filling them prematurely, which was a specific skill, the ability to let your own statement stand rather than immediately undercutting it with a qualification, and one that powerful people cultivated deliberately and that he had never had occasion to develop until now. Charlotte noticed. He knew she noticed because she had the quality of observation that noticed things without announcing it, and because every few weeks she said something small and precise that functioned as a calibration. Not instruction exactly, not feedback exactly, but the kind of adjacent comment that a person makes when they are watching someone find their footing and want to be useful without being prescriptive. In the 6th week, she said, "You were right in the Munich call and you let Hartman talk you into a hedge. Don't do that again." In the 9th week, after a difficult session with the Australian partners, that was good, all of it. He stored both equally. They were data points in his understanding of the new landscape, and he was still mapping. It was in the 10th week that the situation with the Paris office arrived. Meridian had a secondary investment presence in Paris, a small team managing European relationship development, headed by a man named Sylvain Moreau, 53, who had been with the company for 7 years and who was, by all institutional accounts, reliable, experienced, and currently engaged in a negotiation with a French infrastructure development group that had been going on for 4 months and was entering a critical phase. Charlotte brought the Paris situation to Ethan on a Wednesday afternoon. "I need you to read the correspondence," she said, placing a folder on his desk. Actual paper, because some things Charlotte preferred in physical form. The last 6 weeks of written communication between Sylvain and the Dubois group. "Tell me what you see." He took the folder. He read it over the following 2 hours. The emails in French, the meeting notes, the formal letters with their specific registers of courtesy and their specific distances from directness that French formal business writing maintained as a structural preference. He read the way he always read important things, once for content, once for subtext, once more for the thing underneath the subtext that neither party was saying directly. When he was done, he went to Charlotte's office. She was on the phone. She saw him, held up one finger, finished the call in 40 seconds with a precision that suggested the other party had had more to say and had been effectively informed that the call was ending. "Tell me," she said. He sat down. "The surface problem is a licensing timeline disagreement. Dubois wants a 6-month extension on the development rights clause. Sylvain is holding it 3 months because that's what you authorized him to negotiate toward." He paused. "That's what the correspondence says." "And underneath it?" "The Dubois Group's lead negotiator, a man named Chambon, based on the signature, is using a specific register of formal French that in Parisian business culture functions as a signal of considerable personal displeasure that has nothing to do with the timeline." He looked at the top letter. There's a sentence in the 3rd paragraph of his March 14th letter. Sylvain translated it in his summary as, "Chambon expressed preference for a longer development window." What Chambon actually wrote in the register and idiomatic context he used is closer to we had understood the nature of this partnership to be of a different character. That's not a timeline objection. That's a relationship rupture. Charlotte was very still. A relationship rupture, she said. Something happened or didn't happen in the interpersonal dimension of this negotiation that has made Chambon feel the partnership has been misrepresented to him. The timeline argument is the formal vehicle for a personal offense. He paused. Sylvain either doesn't see it or doesn't want to report it. Charlotte turned her pen over twice. Which do you think? I think Sylvain's French is functional and his business instincts are sound, but he's operating in a culture where the gap between what people say formally and what they mean interpersonally is enormous, and he's reading the surface. He met her eyes. I don't think it's incompetence. I think it's a specific blind spot in a context that requires a specific kind of sight. Charlotte was quiet for 10 seconds. I need you to go to Paris, she said. He had not expected this. He sat with it for a moment, examining the edges of the expectation to confirm what he thought it contained. You want me to go in over Sylvain, he said carefully. I want you to go in alongside Sylvain, she said. He has the relationship history with this group. You have the reading of the room. Those aren't the same thing, and they're both necessary. Sylvain may not see it that way. I'll speak to Sylvain, Charlotte said. That's my conversation to have. Your conversation is with Chambon. She paused. Can you go next week? He thought about Emma's schedule, the school pickup days. Mrs. Delgado, who was reliable but had her own rhythms and limitations. The spelling test on Thursday. Emma was working on surveillance and proportional and had opinions about both. Wednesday through Friday, he said. I need to be back Saturday morning. Wednesday through Friday, Charlotte confirmed. Book through Rebecca. He stood. Ethan, Charlotte said. He paused at the door. What was the relationship rupture, she said. What did Meridian do? He had thought about this on the walk from his office to hers. About 3 months ago, Sylvain missed a dinner, he said. It's referenced obliquely in the February correspondence. The Dubois group hosted a formal dinner for the partnership team and Sylvain sent a deputy at the last minute. In American business culture, that's manageable. In Parisian business culture at this level, that specific action communicates a hierarchy of regard that Chambon has been responding to ever since. He paused. A missed dinner. That's what 4 months of stalled negotiation is built on. Charlotte looked at him steadily. A missed dinner, she said quietly, as though she was learning something she hadn't known she didn't know. Language isn't only words, he said. It's also what you show up for. Juan. He told Emma about Paris on Tuesday night over dinner. She received the information with her characteristic processing stillness, head slightly tilted, fork suspended above her plate. Paris, France? She said, in the tone of someone confirming geographical specifics. Paris, France, he confirmed. For work. Yes. She put her fork down. This was her signal that the matter required full conversational engagement. How long? 3 days. I'll be back Saturday morning before you wake up. Mrs. Delgado? Already confirmed. She'll do pickup Thursday and Friday and stay both nights. Emma absorbed the logistics. Then, have you been to Paris before? No, he said. Do you speak French? He looked at her with a slight expression. Right, she said. That's a stupid question, I know. It's not stupid. It kind of is. She picked up her fork again. Will it be cold? March in Paris? Probably. Similar to here. She nodded. She ate. He ate. The kitchen had the specific domestic peace of a meal between two people who were comfortable in each other's silence. Then Emma said, Can you bring me something? What kind of something? A book, she said, in French. A real one. Not a kid's one. A real book in French that I can try to read. He looked at his daughter, who was 8 years old and was already thinking about what it would mean to reach toward a language she didn't yet speak. I'll find you the right one, he said. Something with a good story, she said. Not just grammar. Always a good story first, he agreed. He flew out of JFK Wednesday morning on the 6:15, which required him to leave the apartment at 4 a.m. in the specific dark of early spring. He stood for a moment in the doorway of Emma's room before he left. She was asleep in her standard sideways position, one arm out, perfectly unconscious. He watched her breathe for the count of 3. Then he pulled the door closed and went downstairs to the waiting car. The flight was 7 hours. He spent the first hour reviewing the Dubois correspondence again, the second and third drafting a framework for the conversations ahead, and the remaining 4 hours reading. A novel in French, not for preparation but for pleasure, because the best way to stay inside a language was to inhabit it when the stakes were low. He arrived in Paris at 7 in the evening local time. The city from the taxi was doing what the city did at that hour and that season, the light going golden and long across the rooftops, the boulevards wide and deliberate, the specific quality of Parisian evening that felt somehow both more and less urgent than New York, as though it was moving at a different tempo on a different axis. He checked into the hotel that Rebecca had booked, clean, central, functional, and stood at the window for a while looking at the street below. He had been in other countries only in language before. He had spoken French for years in an apartment in the Bronx, in a grocery store on 148th Street, in his own head during late-night floor buffing sessions on the executive corridor of Harmon Tower. He had built an entire country out of words and grammar, and Madame Fortier's voice telling him to slow down, to feel the rhythm of the sentence, to understand that French didn't hurry. Standing here now, in the actual country, felt strange and right simultaneously, like hearing a song live after knowing only the recorded version. He called Emma from the window. It was 1 in the afternoon in New York. She answered on the second ring, slightly out of breath, clearly just back from something. "I'm here," he said. "What does it look like?" He looked at the street. A woman walked a dog below. A man on a bicycle navigated the intersection with Parisian traffic confidence. 2 people sat at a cafe table with the self-possessed ease of people who had nowhere more important to be. Like a city that decided a long time ago exactly what it wanted to be, he said. Emma considered this. Is that good? I think so. It means it has a kind of certainty about itself. New York doesn't have that, Emma said. New York has the opposite. New York is always arguing about what it is. Which is better? Different things are better for different purposes, he said. For some negotiations, you need certainty. For others, you need argument. A pause on the line. Which do you need this week? He smiled at the window. Both, I think. You're good at both, she said simply. And then, Mrs. Delgado made arroz con pollo, and it's really good. And I had 2 helpings, and she was very pleased. Tell her I said thank you. I will. Dad? Yeah? Come back, okay? I always do. You've never gone to Paris before, she said, with the logic of someone pointing out an unstated assumption. I'll maintain my record, he said. She made the small sound that meant she was satisfied with this answer and said goodnight, even though it was 1 in the afternoon her time, because the logic of the conversation seemed to call for it. He hung up. He stood at the window a little longer. Then he ordered room service, reviewed his notes one more time, and slept deeply and without dreaming. Sylvain Moreau was waiting in the lobby of the hotel Thursday morning at 8. He was a compact man with a precise manner and the particular quality of person who managed professional warmth the way one manages a limited resource, distributed carefully, not squandered. He shook Ethan's hand with correct Parisian professionalism and said, in English, that he was glad Ethan had come, which was said with enough technical accuracy that Ethan could not determine whether it was true. They walked to the cafe Sylvain preferred for working breakfast, 3 blocks, past a boulangerie, whose smell was genuinely the thing people described when they described Paris, and Ethan filed this away as something to tell Emma. Over coffee, Sylvain laid out his perspective on the Dubois situation with the orderly precision of someone who had been preparing this briefing and who wanted it understood that he was fully in command of the facts as he understood them. Ethan listened. He let Sylvain talk for 12 minutes without interruption, which was a thing he had learned from Charlotte. The respect of full attention, the intelligence of not revealing your position before you understood the landscape. When Sylvain finished, Ethan said, "Tell me about the February dinner." A pause. Small, but present. It was an unfortunate scheduling conflict, Sylvain said. I sent Bertrand, who is more than capable. I'm sure he is, Ethan said, but that's not the question. The question is what it communicated to Chambon that you weren't there. Sylvain looked at him with the careful expression of a man deciding whether to be defensive or honest. He appeared to choose honest, which Ethan noted in his favor. I may have underestimated the significance, Sylvain said. You were dealing with an American company's European liaison, operating on American professional norms, Ethan said. In those norms, sending a capable deputy to a business dinner is appropriate delegation. In Chambon's frame, it was a statement about how much the partnership matters to Meridian. He paused. Neither of you is wrong about your own culture. You're just each operating in yours. Sylvain turned his coffee cup slowly. And now? Now we go to the meeting this afternoon and you are there fully, and I translate. Not the words, Chambon's English is excellent, but the register, the subtext. I'll help you understand what he's actually communicating so that you can respond to what he means rather than what he says. Sylvain looked at him. You speak French? Yes. Better than serviceable? Better than serviceable. A beat. Then, in French, Sylvain said, And what do you think of Paris so far, if you don't mind my asking? Ethan replied in French, not the careful, constructed French of a learner demonstrating competence, but the easy, inhabited French of a man who had been living inside the language for years and who knew not just its grammar, but its humor, its tendency toward philosophical aside, the specific rhythm of Parisian speech that loved an elegant digression. He said that Paris reminded him of a sentence that knew exactly where it was going but refused to arrive there directly, and that he meant this as a compliment. Sylvain stared at him. Then, for the first time, he smiled. Not the managed professional warmth, but the actual thing, real and slightly surprised. That, Sylvain said, is the most accurate description of this city I have heard from an American. Madame Fortier was a good teacher, Ethan said. Who is Madame Fortier? She lived on the second floor of my apartment building in the Bronx, Ethan said. She was 81, and she'd been a professor of literature in Lyon, and she charged me nothing for lessons in exchange for reading aloud to her on Tuesday afternoons. Sylvain looked at him across the cafe table with the expression of a man encountering something that didn't fit his prior categories and finding this, on balance, interesting. And you are Director of International Communications, Sylvain said. Yes. How long have you held the role? 10 weeks. Sylvain was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone of a man being deliberately fair, Charlotte Hayes is unconventional in her hiring. She is, Ethan agreed. It's one of her better qualities. The meeting with the Dubois group was at 2 p.m. in a building on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré that conveyed institutional seriousness through its architecture in the specific way that certain Parisian buildings did, not grandly, but with the quiet authority of a place that expected to be taken seriously and generally was. Chambon was 61, silver-haired, with the bearing of a man who had conducted a great many important meetings, and who knew the precise difference between a meeting that was going well and one that was being managed. He greeted Sylvain with the formal warmth of a person who had decided to remain open to a relationship that had disappointed him. He greeted Ethan with curiosity. Mr. Cole, he said, in English that was accented and fluent. Charlotte Hayes' new communications director. Yes, Ethan said. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chambon. They settled around the table, Chambon and 2 of his team on one side, Ethan and Sylvain on the other, with the formal documents and the water and the specific arrangement of a meeting that had weight on both sides. For the first 20 minutes, Ethan said almost nothing. He listened. He listened to Chambon the way he had listened to the conference room through the frosted glass, not just for content, but for current, for the direction the water was running beneath the surface. And what he heard, in the careful formality of Chambon's French and the specific weight of his silences and the way he looked at Sylvain when Sylvain spoke, was not anger exactly, but something older and more fundamental, the particular disappointment of a person who had extended trust and felt it handled carelessly. At the 30-minute mark, during a natural pause in the exchange, Ethan spoke. He spoke in French. He addressed Chambon directly, and he said, carefully, specifically, in the register that the situation required, which was neither apologetic nor defensive, but honest. Mr. Chambon, I think we've been discussing the licensing timeline when the conversation that actually needs to happen is a different one. I'd like to have that conversation, if you're willing. The room went still in the way rooms go still when someone has named the thing that everyone was working around. Chambon looked at him. His expression was very controlled, but beneath the control, something was watching, assessing, deciding. Go on, Chambon said. Meridian values this partnership, Ethan said. The February dinner was a failure of presence that communicated the opposite of what's true, and I think it has colored every conversation since. I want to say that directly rather than allowing the timeline discussion to carry weight it was never designed to carry. He paused. He watched Chambon's face. Chambon was quiet for a moment. His two colleagues beside him were very still. Then Chambon said in French, "It's the first time anyone from Meridian has said that." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm sorry it took this long." What happened in the room over the following 2 hours was not dramatic in the way of conference room crises or sudden revelations. It was quieter and more significant. The patient, careful work of rebuilding a thing that had been damaged not by malice, but by inattention, by the specific cultural blindness that comes from assuming everyone is operating on the same unspoken terms. The timeline discussion happened. The 6-month extension was negotiated toward 4, which was not the 3 Sylvain had been authorized, but which Charlotte, when Ethan called her from the hotel at 7 that evening, confirmed she could approve. 4 months, Charlotte said. And the relationship? Repaired, I think, Ethan said. Chambon wants a formal dinner next month. Sylvain will be there. You'll be there too? Charlotte said. If it's useful, he said. It will be. A pause. How's Paris? He looked at the window. The evening light, the street below, the city that knew exactly what it was. It's good, he said. Emma asked me to bring her a book in French. Did you find one? This afternoon, before the meeting. A collection of short stories, Maupassant. Age-appropriate in terms of length, demanding in terms of vocabulary. She'll love it. You know your daughter, Charlotte said. I do, he said. He hung up. He sat on the edge of the hotel bed with the book for Emma in his hand, small, blue-covered, with the slightly worn quality of a second-hand bookshop find, which was where he'd found it, on a narrow street 2 blocks from the cafe where he and Sylvain had had breakfast. He turned it over. He thought about what Emma had said on the phone the previous night. Come back okay. He thought about 3 months of learning to occupy visible space without being distorted by it. He thought about the conference room on 42 and the service corridor, and Yolanda's voice saying, I've been telling people for 3 years that you were not a regular person. He thought about Sarah, who had died not knowing that their daughter would one day ask for a book in French, who had died before she could see what Emma was becoming. He thought about all the distance between the man who had cleaned these kinds of buildings and the man who now worked in them. Not the external distance, the floors and the titles and the salary, but the interior distance, the slow and difficult journey of learning to believe that the space you occupy has been earned. He put the book carefully in his bag, beside his notes and his Swahili grammar, which had come to Paris with him because some habits were not habits at all, but architecture. He picked up the grammar. He read 3 pages. He did not perform this for anyone. There was no one to perform it for. He read because the language was still in progress, because in progress was where he preferred to live, because a thing fully completed was a thing you were done growing inside of, and he was not done growing inside of anything. Outside, Paris moved through its evening with the self-possessed certainty of a city that had decided what it was. Inside the hotel room, a man from Harlem, with a book in French and a worn grammar textbook and an offer letter folded inside his jacket pocket, sat with the particular quiet of someone who had traveled a very long way and was beginning, carefully, to understand how far. He was back Saturday morning, as promised, before Emma woke up. The flight had landed at JFK at 6:40, the March air outside the terminal carrying the specific raw cold of a New York morning that had no interest in being welcoming, and he had taken a car service back to 148th Street rather than the subway because the bag was heavy and he was tired in the good way, the way that comes from having done something real and difficult and done it well. He climbed the 4 flights of stairs past the still broken elevator, put his key in the door, and stepped into the apartment that smelled of Mrs. Delgado's cooking and the particular lived-in warmth of home. Mrs. Delgado was asleep on the pull-out couch in the living room, which she had arranged with the military precision of a woman who believed that even temporary sleeping arrangements deserved dignity. He set down his bag quietly, left a note and an envelope on the kitchen counter. The envelope containing what he owed her plus extra, because extra was not optional when someone slept on a pull-out couch to watch your daughter, and went to the hallway. Emma's door was pushed to its usual three-quarter position. He stood in the gap. She was asleep in the standard configuration, sideways, one arm extended, hair across the pillow. The Maupassant book was already on her desk, which meant Mrs. Delgado had found it in his bag where he'd left it deliberately visible. Emma had placed it beside her school library book with the careful positioning of something being treated as significant. He watched her breathe. He thought about how many times he had stood in this doorway, in the years when the standing was the only thing holding certain hours together, when coming home to this particular sleeping face had been the counterweight to everything that the night shift cost him. He had stood here in January cold when the heat was uneven and he'd checked twice that the blanket was adequate. He had stood here during the months when Emma was first adjusting to first grade and had sometimes cried before school in a way she thought he didn't know about and which had required every discipline he possessed not to absorb visibly. He had stood here on ordinary nights and extraordinary ones, and the doorway had always been the same doorway, and she had always been the same daughter, and the love had always been exactly what it was. Complete, non-negotiable, the fixed point around which every other variable arranged itself. He pulled the door to its original angle and went to bed. He slept until 9:30, which was the latest he had slept in longer than he could calculate. Emma woke him at 9:47 by sitting on the edge of his bed with the Maupassant book in her lap, open to the first page, wearing the expression of someone who had been patient for approximately as long as patience was going to be available. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he confirmed, sitting up. "I found the book." "I see that." She held it up. "I read the first paragraph," she said. "I didn't understand most of it, but I understood il était, which means he was." "That's where every story starts," Ethan said. "Someone was." Emma considered this. She looked at the first paragraph again, moving her finger beneath the French the way she moved it beneath English when she was learning the shape of a sentence. "Il était un de ces jolis garçons," she read slowly and carefully, each word handled like something that might break if rushed. Her accent was American and unpracticed and entirely genuine, and he thought it was the most beautiful French he had ever heard. "What does it mean?" she said. "He was one of those pretty boys," Ethan said. "Maupassant is setting someone up to be complicated." Emma closed the book on her finger to hold the place. "Did it work? In Paris?" "Yes." "Tell me." He told her, not the version compressed for a child, but the real version, because Emma had never responded well to compressed versions, and because she was the person he most wanted to tell it to. He told her about Chambon and the missed dinner and the cultural distance between what was said and what was meant. He told her about the afternoon meeting and the moment of naming the thing that everyone was working around. He told her about Sylvain's expression over breakfast when the French came out of Ethan's mouth the way Madame Fortier had taught him, with rhythm, with digression, with the specific unhurried quality of a language that did not hurry. Emma listened without interruption, which was her highest form of engagement. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The dinner was the real problem all along," she said. "Yes." "Not the contract." "The contract was the shape the problem took," he said. "But the shape isn't the problem. Understanding the difference between those two things. That's most of the work." Emma turned the Maupassant book over in her hands. She seemed to be filing the lesson somewhere systematic and permanent. "Is that what you do now?" she said. "For your job. Find the difference between the shape and the problem." He looked at his daughter, sitting on the edge of his bed on a Saturday morning in March, with her mother's face and her serious eyes, and a book in French held carefully in both hands. "That's exactly what I do," he said. She nodded as though a hypothesis had been confirmed. "I'm going to learn French," she said. It was not a question or a proposal. It was a statement of decision, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who had made up their mind and was simply informing the relevant parties. "I'll teach you," he said. "Madame Fortier's way?" "Stories first," he said. "Grammar follows the story." Emma opened the book again. Il était, she read. He was. She looked up. Okay. Start there. Ought. The months that followed moved with the steady building momentum of something that has found its proper footing and is no longer spending energy on balance. Spring came to Manhattan with its usual combination of false starts and genuine warmth, the trees on 148th Street producing their annual optimistic leaves, while the temperature fluctuated between winter and spring with the indecision of a city that had learned not to commit too early. Emma started keeping a French vocabulary notebook, a small red one she'd chosen specifically, which she carried in her school bag alongside her regular notebooks, and which she filled with words and their English equivalents, and increasingly short sentences of her own construction that she read to Ethan in the evenings with the focused pronunciation of someone taking the work seriously. At Meridian, the architecture of what Ethan had been building became visible in the way things become visible when they have accumulated enough structure to stand on their own. The Inchin project reached a successful milestone agreement. The Guadalajara development, Valentina Cruz's project, the one where the structural engineering concern had finally entered the formal record, moved into its construction phase with a clarity of documentation that the previous phase had lacked entirely, and Valentina sent Ethan a message in Spanish that said simply, "This is what the project always could have been. Thank you for the space to speak." He kept that message alongside Whitfield's email in his desk drawer. The Paris relationship stabilized. Chambon came to New York in April for the formal partnership dinner, the makeup dinner, the one Sylvain attended entirely and which Ethan attended as well, at Chambon's specific invitation. It was held at a French restaurant in the West Village, where the service was excellent and the food was what Madame Fortier would have called honnête, honest, without performance. Chambon had been reserved with Ethan in Paris, professional and assessing, but over dinner in New York, over a second glass of Bordeaux and a conversation about Maupassant that had begun accidentally and continued with the self-sustaining energy of two people who had found unexpected common ground, something different emerged. "You're teaching your daughter to read French," Chambon said in French. "Stories first," Ethan said. Chambon smiled. The genuine version, which Ethan had now seen twice, and which he had come to understand was given rarely and meant something specific when it appeared. "My grandfather taught me to read with Maupassant," Chambon said. "He said the stories were short enough to finish and long enough to mean something." "He was right," Ethan said. Chambon looked at him across the table with the expression of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd been working toward for some time. "I misjudged the quality of Meridian's attention," Chambon said. "I want you to know I understand that now." "The February dinner made that judgment seem reasonable," Ethan said. "The judgment wasn't wrong given what you had." "Most people would not say that," Chambon said. "Most people would want credit for the repair," Ethan said. "I'm more interested in the relationship being functional." Chambon picked up his glass. "To functional relationships," he said. "And honest dinners," Ethan said. They drank. Across the table, Sylvain was deep in conversation with two of Chambon's team members, his French more relaxed now, less careful, finding its natural register, which was something Ethan had been quietly working on with him over the previous weeks, the difference between technically correct French and inhabitable French. It was coming. Sylvain was not a fast learner, but he was a determined one, and determination, in Ethan's experience, outlasted talent in the long run. James Whitfield came to Ethan's office in May with a situation that had nothing to do with translation. He came in, sat down with his familiar, measured manner, and placed a folder on the desk. He had been doing this more regularly now, bringing Ethan into legal situations at the early stage rather than the crisis stage, which represented a significant shift from the careful institutional skepticism of those first weeks. The shift had happened gradually through the accumulation of instances where Ethan's reading of a situation had proven accurate, and Whitfield was a man who revised his positions based on evidence, which made him, in Ethan's assessment, one of the more reliable people in the building. "This is different from the usual," Whitfield said. Ethan opened the folder. Inside was a report, internal, formatted as a legal memo, concerning Meridian's cleaning services contractor. He looked at it. He looked at Whitfield. "The contractor is in violation of 3 labor provisions," Whitfield said. "Overtime calculation, break scheduling, and a benefits contribution shortfall that's been ongoing for 18 months. Legal has the documentation. Charlotte has been briefed. We're terminating the contract and moving to a new provider. All right, Ethan said carefully. There's a second component, Whitfield said. Charlotte wants to identify any current building services employees who may be owed back compensation and ensure they receive it with an additional good faith settlement. She's asked me to work with you on the communication approach, specifically regarding how we inform the affected employees, given that several of them may not be fully comfortable with written English or with formal institutional communication. Ethan was very still. She asked for me specifically, he said. Yes, Whitfield said. He looked at the folder. He thought about the break room on 38 and the yellow assignment sheets and Luis singing and Yolanda's 19 years and Dimitri's eloquent eyebrows. He thought about the service entrance on 52nd Street and the fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a frequency designed to be just below conscious irritation. I want to be the one who tells them, Ethan said, in person, not a letter. Whitfield looked at him. That's not standard procedure for... No, Ethan said. It's not. But these are people who have learned over a long time to expect that formal communication from a company means something is being taken from them. A letter in a language some of them don't read fluently is not going to communicate what Charlotte intends it to communicate. He paused. Let me talk to them directly. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. I'll clear it with Charlotte, he said. Charlotte cleared it in 4 minutes. He went down on a Thursday night, not at 9 when the evening shift was at its most organized and efficient and the supervisors were present, at 11:30 when the upper floor crews were in their mid-shift rhythm, when the break room on 38 would be occupied with the particular population of people taking the precise amount of time they were allowed before returning to the floors. He took the service elevator. He came in through the back, the way he had come in every night for 3 years, down the corridor that smelled of industrial solvent and old coffee, past the board where the yellow assignment sheets were still pinned in their row. He pushed open the break room door. Yolanda was there. Luis. 3 other members of the crew he knew by face and name. A woman he hadn't met who was new, hired in the months after his departure, sitting at the end of the table with the careful self-containment of someone still finding their footing. The room went briefly, completely silent. Yolanda stared at him. He was wearing his suit, his important shirt. He had his jacket on, which meant the full weight of the new version of himself was present in the room, visibly, against the background of the yellow sheets and the aging coffee maker, and the folding table where he had read his grammars for 3 years. Then Yolanda said, in the voice of someone who had been waiting for exactly this, "Well, look who remembered where he came from." "I told you I wouldn't disappear," he said. "You did," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the table. Luis slid a coffee in front of him, the break room coffee, which was terrible in a specific and familiar way that he found on this particular evening, close to perfect. He told them. He told them about the contractor violations and the back compensation and Charlotte's decision and what was going to happen next. He told them in the plain, direct English that the situation required, and then he told the parts that mattered to specific people in their own languages. Luis in Spanish, the new woman who turned out to be from the Philippines in Tagalog, a brief clarification for a crew member he hadn't met who spoke primarily Portuguese. The room received this information with the particular quality of people who had learned not to trust good news immediately, but who were genuinely, cautiously moved by it. Luis said in Spanish, "She's paying back what they owe us." "Yes," Ethan said in Spanish. "Why?" Luis said. Not suspiciously. Honestly. "Because it's right," Ethan said, "and because she knows that now in a way she might not have before." Luis nodded slowly. Yolanda had been very quiet through all of this, which was unusual enough to register. She was looking at Ethan with an expression he couldn't fully read, something layered, something that held multiple things at once. When the others had asked their questions and he had answered them, and the room had settled into the specific relief of people who have been told something genuinely good, Yolanda caught his eye. "Walk with me," she said. They went out into the corridor. The floor buffer sat idle against the wall. The fluorescent tubes buzzed their familiar subconscious frequency. The building was quiet in the way it was always quiet at this hour, occupied but hushed, doing its overnight self-maintenance. "You came back," Yolanda said. "I said I would." "People say a lot of things," she crossed her arms. 19 years I've been in this building. I've watched a lot of people go up and not come back down. Not in the bad way. Just the way where the floors change, and then everything changes." She looked at him steadily. "You came back in person, and you spoke to them in their own languages, and you sat at that table and drank that terrible coffee." "The coffee is still terrible," he confirmed. "It has always been terrible." She paused. "You didn't have to do it this way. You could have sent Whitfield." "No," he said. "I couldn't." "Why not?" He looked at the corridor, at the service door at the end, at the fluorescent tubes. He thought about the thing he'd said to Emma on the subway ride back from his first day, about coming in through a different door but heading to the same home. "Because these are my people," he said. "They were my people before the other thing happened, and they're my people now, and that doesn't change with the floor you work on." He paused. "I'm not better than anyone in that room. I'm luckier. The situation found me. It could have found any of them." Yolanda looked at him for a long moment. "It didn't find them," she said. "It found you, and you walked through the door." He thought about this. "Yolanda, what you said on my last shift, about not letting the new floors make me forget the ones I came from. I remember." "I haven't," he said. "I won't." She uncrossed her arms. She looked at him with the full, unguarded expression of a woman who had spent 19 years being an accurate reader of people and who had made a determination. "No," she said. "You haven't." She turned back toward the break room. "Now go home. It's almost midnight and you have work in the morning." "So do you," he said. "Some of us," she said without turning around, "have been going to work at midnight for 19 years. We're used to it." He smiled at her back. He went to the service elevator. He rode it down to the basement, walked through the corridor one more time, and left through the service entrance on 52nd Street. Not because it was the only door available to him anymore, but because it was the door that was true. And truth was something he had decided a long time ago to maintain regardless of the context. Summer arrived, and with it a rhythm that Ethan had not known since before Emma was born, the rhythm of a life that had space in it. Not empty space, not the hollow kind that echoes, but the inhabited kind. The kind that exists when a life has been built with enough structural integrity to support the weight of ordinary happiness. He picked Emma up from school on the 3 days he'd negotiated, and sometimes a fourth when the week allowed. He was home for dinner most evenings, which was a change whose significance Emma never stated directly, but which he measured in the quality of the apartment at 6 p.m., the way it sounded different when he was in it, fuller, more itself. On weekend mornings, they read French together, Emma's vocabulary notebook filling at a rate that surprised even him. She had a linguistic aptitude she hadn't known she had, or perhaps had always had, but had not yet been given the specific key that unlocked it, and French was that key. The language of Madame Fortier and Chambon and the Paris street below his hotel window, the language that had come back to him from a second-hand bookshop on a narrow street and arrived in the apartment on 148th Street, wrapped in blue covers and possibility. By June, Emma was reading Maupassant aloud with enough fluency to feel the rhythm of the sentences, and when she did, she made the same sound Ethan sometimes made inside his own reading. A small exhale, barely audible, the involuntary response to a sentence that was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. "He's funny," Emma said once, looking up from a story. "I didn't expect funny." "Maupassant, he's very funny." "In a sad way," she said. "Yes," he said. "That's the best kind of funny, the kind that knows how close it lives to the other thing." Emma considered this with her characteristic seriousness. Then she wrote something in her vocabulary notebook, which she did when something needed preserving. He didn't ask what she wrote. Some things were hers to keep. The second international summit at Harmon Tower happened in September. It had been 14 months since the first one. 14 months since the 12 interpreters, and the 8 national flags, and the frozen negotiation, and the man no one had noticed standing in the service corridor with a grammar book under his arm. This summit was larger, 12 countries, a partnership agreement that had taken 20 months to reach this stage, and a significance that Charlotte had been characterizing in her pre-summit briefings as the most consequential single negotiation Meridian had undertaken in a decade. Ethan had spent 3 weeks preparing. He had reviewed every correspondence, every prior meeting transcript, every cultural briefing document. He had identified the 9 specific points of potential linguistic friction across the 12 delegations, the places where translation had historically been reductive, where idiomatic gaps created misreadings, where the formal register of one culture collided with the informal directness of another. He had written a 12-page internal document, the kind of document that would never be circulated externally, that existed purely to prepare the room, outlining every potential misunderstanding and its prevention. He had briefed the interpretation team personally. Not condescendingly, he had been clear from the beginning that he respected their credentials and their preparation, but specifically in the way that preparation requires specificity. He had gone through the 9 friction points. He had given examples. He had made himself available for questions and received good ones, which told him the team was serious. Charlotte had read the 12-page document twice. "This is exceptional," she had said on the Thursday before the summit. "It's preparation," he had said. "Most people," she said, "can't prepare for what they can't see." He had thought about this, about the service corridor and the frosted glass and the years of listening from the outside of rooms, about what you developed over time when you were the person on the other side of the glass. "I learned to see from a particular angle," he said. "It turns out to be a useful one." What? The morning of the summit, he arrived at Harmon Tower at 7:15. He entered through the front entrance. This had been true for months now, had ceased to register as a deliberate choice, and had become simply the way he arrived, the same way the dark slacks and the jacket had become simply what he wore and the 42nd floor had become simply where he worked. He rode the elevator up. At the 40th floor, he stepped out and walked the corridor toward the conference suite, the same corridor he had buffed at 1 in the morning, the same carpet that had absorbed sound completely, the same dark wood of the office doors. He walked it as he had always walked it, with attention, with presence, noticing what there was to notice. The conference suite was already in preparation. The 12 national flags were arranged along the center of the table. More flags now, more countries, a longer row. The interpretation equipment was set up and being tested by a technician. The room held the specific held-breath quality of a space that knew something important was coming. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He thought about the first time he had stood in this doorway, from the other side, from the service side, looking through frosted glass at a world that hadn't known he was there. He stepped inside. He walked to the head of the table, where his materials were already arranged, his notes, his reference documents, his water glass. He pulled out the chair and sat down and looked at the flags and the empty seats and the room waiting to fill with the voices of 12 nations attempting to find common ground. He was ready. The delegates arrived at 9. Ethan greeted each delegation personally, in their own language, with the specific welcome that the cultural context required, formal with the Japanese delegation, warm and slightly more direct with the Brazilian team, precise and respectful with the German representatives, and with Chambon's French colleagues, who were part of the summit now that the Dubois partnership was formally established, a greeting in French that carried the weight of the months of work that had brought them to this table. Chambon himself was among the French delegation. He shook Ethan's hand, held it a moment longer than a standard handshake. "Your daughter," he said in French. "Is she still reading Maupassant?" "She finished the collection last month," Ethan said. "She's asking for Flaubert." Chambon smiled. "The genuine one, the one given rarely. She has good taste." "She has her mother's instincts," Ethan said. Charlotte took her position at the head of the table as the delegates settled. She looked across the room at Ethan, who was positioned to her right, and she gave him the small, precise nod of a person who has prepared thoroughly and trusts the preparation. He returned it. The summit began. It went well. More than well. It went with the quality that the best negotiations achieve, which is not the absence of friction, but the productive navigation of it. The room working through its genuine differences toward genuine agreement because the communication was functioning at the level the stakes required. There were 3 moments during the summit where Ethan's specific reading of the room made the difference. 3 moments where a phrase, a tone, a silence carried a meaning that the formal translation hadn't caught, and he addressed them quietly, precisely, without theater. Once in Mandarin, once in Arabic, once in the specific register of formal Korean, where the distinction between a firm position and an openness to continued discussion was entirely a matter of inflection. Each time the room realigned. Not dramatically. The realignment of a room that is working well is subtle, almost invisible, felt more than seen. But he felt it. The way you feel a current change direction in water, and he knew the others felt it too. At 4:15 in the afternoon, the summit reached its agreement. The lead document was signed by 12 representatives in sequence, each signing with the specific gravity of a person who understood the weight of what the signature meant. The room held the quality of people who had worked hard and arrived somewhere real. There was a controlled professional satisfaction in it, not celebration exactly, but acknowledgement, the particular resonance of a thing completed that was worth completing. Charlotte stood and addressed the room. Brief, direct, substantive, exactly right. Ethan sat at the table and listened to her voice and looked at the 12 flags and thought about a different version of this room, 14 months earlier, with 8 flags instead of 12, and a silence that had broken across it like something falling. He thought about the service corridor. He thought about the 60 seconds. He thought about Emma writing accommodation 5 times in her careful printing and the sparrow on the ceiling trying to fly towards something. He thought about the whole distance between there and here. Not the floors, not the titles, not the salary, but the interior distance. The one that had been traveled in the small hours of many mornings with a grammar book open on a subway car or a break room table or a kitchen counter. The distance covered in the patient, unseen accumulation of knowledge that no one had asked for and everyone had eventually needed. He thought, this is what it was for, not just the promotion, not just the room, but the whole of it. The years of learning languages in the margins of a life that had not been arranged for learning, the stubborn continuation of growth in circumstances that did not reward it, the accumulated conviction that what you carried inside you had value whether or not anyone had yet found occasion to confirm it. This is what it was for. After the delegates had gone and the room had been restored to its baseline state of ordered readiness, Charlotte found him standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows looking at the city. The late afternoon light was doing what September light in New York did, coming in at an angle that made everything briefly luminous, the buildings catching it and holding it in a way that would be gone in an hour and could not be manufactured or preserved. Charlotte stood beside him. For a moment, they both looked at the city without speaking, which had become, over the months, a comfortable silence. The silence of two people who had learned each other's language in the way that working closely builds a language, and who no longer needed to fill every space. Good summit, she said. Very good, he said. She turned to look at him. I've been thinking about something I want to say to you. He looked at her. When you knocked on that door, she said, I almost didn't open it. I want you to know that. I almost sent the guard back to tell you the meeting was private. She paused. I didn't, in the end. Some instinct, I don't know exactly what, but the margin was smaller than it should have been. He was quiet. I'm telling you this, she continued, not to revisit the past, but because I want to be honest about what it means going forward. What we almost lost. Not just the deal, but you, this, everything that has come from you being in this building differently. That was a near thing, and I don't want to be the kind of leader who is comfortable with near things. What does that mean practically? He said. It means I've been rethinking how we find people, she said, what we look at and what we overlook. Who gets 60 seconds and who gets the immediate table? She paused. I want your input on that. He turned this over carefully. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, a large thing, made larger by the specific history that gave it context. There are a lot of service corridors and a lot of buildings, he said. People standing outside the glass who know exactly what's being said and how to fix it. Yes, she said. The uniform isn't the person, he said. You know that now. The question is whether the institution knows it. That's the work, Charlotte said. I'd like you to help design that work. He looked at the city. The light was already shifting, the luminous angle moving, the buildings returning to their standard selves as the sun continued its trajectory westward. All right, he said. Oops. That evening he walked home. Not the whole way. It was 40 blocks, which was a reasonable walk in September, and he had learned to take the long way when the day allowed it, to move through the city on foot and feel its texture, the way languages had texture that you only understood by inhabiting them at pace. He walked through this park, up the long avenues, through the neighborhoods that shifted in character every 10 blocks in the way that only Manhattan shifted. The transitions not gradual, but immediate, like turning a page. He walked through his own neighborhood in the early evening light, past Chen's family market, which had changed ownership twice since Henry Chen died but still occupied the same corner, still had the same awning in faded red. He stopped for a moment in front of it. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the storefront and thought about a 71-year-old man from Fujian province who had loved an argument the way other people loved music, who had taught Mandarin to a young man from Harlem across 4 years of conversations about economics and fish and the quality of modern education, who had never once considered that the person across the counter was anything less than a full and serious mind. "Thank you, Henry," he thought, "for the language, and for treating me like someone worth speaking to." He went inside and bought a loaf of bread, because they needed bread, and he walked the last 6 blocks home in the September evening. Well, Emma was at the kitchen table when he came in, the French vocabulary notebook open and the Flaubert novel, Trois Contes, which Chambon had recommended specifically and which Ethan had ordered for her the week before, propped open beside it. She looked up when the door opened with the expression of someone who had been waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting. "How was it?" she said. "We got the agreement," he said. He put the bread on the counter. He hung up his jacket. He sat across from her at the kitchen table the way he had sat across from her for years. This table, these 2 chairs, the specific geography of home. "All 12 countries?" Emma said. "All 12. She looked at her notebook. "That's a lot of languages to manage at once." "It is," he said. She turned the Flaubert over. "Chambon's people were there? The French ones?" "Chambon himself. He asked about you." Emma looked up with the expression of someone trying to appear less pleased than they were. "What did you say?" "I said you'd finished Maupassant and were asking for Flaubert." "What did he say?" "He said you had good taste." Emma looked at the book. Something moved across her face, a satisfaction that was private and complete, the satisfaction of a person who has been recognized in a way that means something because it comes from someone who would know. "Okay," she said. Then with a studied casualness that was not quite casual, "What's Flaubert like compared to Maupassant?" "Slower," Ethan said. "More interested in the interior. Maupassant watches people from the outside. Flaubert wants to know what they're thinking when no one is watching." Emma absorbed this. Which is more true to life? He thought about this honestly, about years of observing people from corridors and service entrances and the edges of rooms, about the interior life he had carried quietly through spaces that had no interest in interior lives, about Charlotte in her office saying, "I owe you an apology," and meaning it, about Yolanda in the break room corridor saying, "These are my people," and it being true, about Emma at 8 years old saying, "You know everything with the spelling wrong and the meaning perfectly right." "Both," he said, "at the same time, which is the hard part." Emma nodded as though this confirmed something. She picked up her pen and wrote something in the vocabulary notebook. He watched her hand move across the page with the focused intention of someone adding something to the record that they wanted kept. "What did you write?" he said. She showed him. In her careful printing, beside the French word visible, she had written, "What you are when the right person finally looks." He sat at the kitchen table of the apartment on 148th Street in the September evening light, and he looked at what his daughter had written, and he was quiet for a long moment. "That's exactly right," he said. Emma closed the notebook. "I know," she said. She picked up the Flaubert and opened it to the first page. "Trois contes," she read, pronouncing it carefully. 3 stories. She looked up at him. "Like us? 3?" He looked at her. "Like us," he said. 3. Outside, the city continued its argument with itself about what it was and what it was becoming, the way it always had, the way it always would. Up the street, Mr. Okonkwo was making a goosey soup for the 1000th time. The elevator in the building was still broken, the stairs still 4 flights, the walls still thin. The water stain on the bedroom ceiling still looked like a sparrow in flight. But inside the apartment, a father and his daughter sat at a kitchen table in a late September light that was going gold and long across the walls, reading French together, and the sparrow on the ceiling was no longer frozen between leaving and staying. It had found the thing it was flying toward, and it was here.